The lamps burn low, their light trembling against windows rimed with ice. The air tastes of soot and smoke, sharp as iron, bitter as hunger. Each gust that seeps beneath the door carries the moan of the river, a deep, frozen sound like something ancient stirring in its sleep. Outside, the Thames no longer moves. It lies stiff and white beneath the weight of a dead winter, where once lively ferrymen now trudge across its back as though walking on a grave. Somewhere far off, a church bell cracks mid-ring, silenced by frost. It is the winter of 1813 when London, proud and pulsing with empire, found itself strangled by ice. Chimneys froze shut, milk turned solid in the pail, and the poor gathered around the dying glow of street lamps as if they were altars. The great and the desperate alike huddled in rooms thick with their own breath, burning furniture, books, even coffins to keep the dark at bay. The Thames became a carnival and a coffin both bright, tents raised over black water that would soon claim its debt. Some called it beautiful, others called it judgment. But history remembers it as the year the city turned to glass, when London itself froze in place, and the poor froze with it. So tonight, draw closer to the fire, if you have one. Keep your breath shallow, and listen, because this is how it began, when the river stopped flowing, and death walked quietly over the ice. The morning it happened, London woke without sound. No gulls circling over the wharves, no oars dipping through the grey water, no creak of rope or call of ferryman. The Thames, that black, breathing heart of the city, had gone still in the night. From Westminster to Wapping, the river lay stiff and pale beneath a skin of ice, so smooth it reflected the sky like glass. Men stood at the banks in silence, boots sunk in frost, staring as though the world had ended quietly while they slept. Somewhere, a child threw a pebble. It bounced once, twice, and did not break through. The sound was small, almost holy. The air carried a bite that morning, the kind that made breath visible, that made every cough a ghost. The fishermen, rough-handed and red-nosed, cursed into their scarves as they found their nets frozen to the pier. Barges sat trapped midstream, their ropes snapping as the ice thickened around them, their cargo sealed beneath nature's lock. It was said the cold had come creeping down from the north, through forests and moors, across the fields of Kent, until even London, proud, sooty, restless London, bowed before it. By noon, frost rimed the iron railings along Blackfriars Bridge, the metal groaning softly under its new weight. The watermen, who once ferried nobles and beggars alike, stood useless, watching the river that had fed them turn traitor. Some whispered that it was God's punishment. Others said it was witchcraft, that something deep beneath the river had finally woken. But most said nothing at all. They simply stamped their feet and blew on their hands, because talking did nothing against the cold. In the alleys behind Fleet Street, washing lines hung heavy with shirts turned to boards. Dogs lay curled in doorways, their breath thin and trembling. The air smelled faintly of coal dust and iron, of a city holding its breath. Across London Bridge, a milkman found his horse stiff where it stood, eyes frozen open, the cart still harnessed as though waiting for a command. He left it there, walking home with the reins dragging behind him. By evening, the ice had thickened enough for the brave or the desperate to step onto it. Boys ran laughing from the banks, sliding and falling, their shouts echoing through the blue dusk. A few soldiers followed, stamping their boots in disbelief. Then more came. Drawn by curiosity or hunger or the strange beauty of it all, a city suddenly granted a mirror of itself. The lamps along the river flared one by one, their light trembling across the frozen surface like stars caught in glass. But beneath the shimmer, the water still moved slow, dark, angry. It whispered against the ice like something alive, waiting, and those who listened long enough swore they could hear it, the low hum of the Thames beneath its shell, like a creature gasping for air. London did not yet know it, but that morning marked the beginning of a long, merciless season. The river had stopped breathing, and soon, so would many of those who lived beside it. By the second morning, the frost had crept farther than the river. It clung to the rooftops and railings, to the shutters of every window, to the buttons of every coat. It turned the breath of horses into clouds that lingered like ghosts above the streets. Londoners awoke to a world remade in white, not the soft white of Christmas or charity, but a hard, biting white that glittered like broken glass. The city, so loud and ceaseless in its motion, now moved in slow, careful silence. Even the smoke that rose from the chimneys drifted sluggishly, reluctant to leave the warmth of the fire. Inside the narrow houses along Cheapside, frost bloomed on the inside of the window panes, delicate flowers that no one dared touch. Children traced them with their fingers until their skin burned, pretending they were drawing gardens in another world. Mothers broke the ice that had formed inside their water jugs, their knuckles reddened and raw. The little they could pour into a pot took longer and longer to boil, for even fire seemed slower in the cold. Bread turned hard before it cooled, and candles cracked when lit, their wax too brittle to hold the flame. Down in the alleys near the docks, the poor made fires out of whatever would burn. Broken crates, splintered chairs, whole doors torn from their hinges. The smell of singed paint and damp wood filled the air. In the smoke, figures crouched close together, their faces dimly lit, men with their hands cupped around the last of the warmth, women shielding babies from the wind with shawls that had turned stiff as bark. The frost made everyone look older. Even the young had grey about them now, in their hair, on their lashes, on the tips of their breath. At the markets, the cold worked its cruelty with quiet precision. Apples burst in their barrels, milk froze in the churns, and meat hung in sheets of white, more sculpture than sustenance. Vendors rubbed their hands and stamped their feet, trying to call out their wares, between shivers. A butcher laughed bitterly that at least the cold kept the flies away. A baker beside him didn't answer. His dough had frozen solid before he could bake it. In Westminster, the carriages of the rich rolled more slowly, wheels cracking against the frozen ruts. Behind the frosted windows, ladies in fur-lined cloaks pressed gloved hands to the glass, watching the beggars move between the lamplight like shadows. Their husbands spoke of commerce and empire, of the canals in Holland freezing and the ships in the Baltic trapped, as if the city's suffering were proof of London's place in the world. But their voices grew quieter as the days passed, for even coal became scarce, and no amount of silver could buy warmth that did not exist. By dusk, the fog returned, heavy, colourless, and close. It wrapped itself around the spires and the steeples, blurred the lamps until the whole city looked submerged in ice. The Thames lay beneath it all, unmoving, pale, and vast. Smoke rose above the stillness, dark as breath from something dying. The frost was not yet finished with London. It was only learning how to stay. On the fourth day of the freeze, when the ice no longer groaned beneath a man's step, London began to gather upon the river. At first, it was only a few brave souls, fishermen, hawkers, and ragged boys with nothing to lose. They tested the Thames with careful feet, stamping and laughing, daring one another farther out. The ice, nearly a foot thick in places, held firm beneath their boots. It was said that if the river could bear the weight of a horse, it could bear the weight of a city, and so it began a carnival, raised upon a corpse. By noon, word spread from Westminster to Wapping. The river had turned into a fairground. Merchants hauled carts onto the ice, their wheels squealing over frozen seams. Tents went up like pale mushrooms, their canvas glinting with frost. The air filled with the scent of roasting chestnuts, tallow smoke, and rum-soaked laughter. In a city starved for warmth and cheer, the frozen Thames had become both stage and salvation. Children sold gingerbread and ribbons along the makeshift lanes. A fiddler stood near Blackfriars Bridge, playing tunes so bright and fast that even the cold seemed to tap its heel. Women wrapped in patched shawls danced with soldiers, their skirts brushing snow from the ice. A man led a bear on a chain across the river's centre, the beast's breath steaming like smoke as it poured at the ground. For a moment, it seemed that London had forgotten hunger, forgotten the cold, forgotten the weeks of grey skies and stiff hands. The fair shone like a dream made from desperation, but beneath the laughter, the river murmured. Deep below the frozen crust, black water shifted, restless, unseen. Old boatmen refused to step onto the ice, muttering that the Thames was not meant to be walked upon. They said the river had moods, that she remembered every name whispered to her depths: sailors lost, children drowned, bodies pushed from bridges in the dark. And now the living danced on her back. As daylight faded, lanterns were hung from poles, their flames flickering orange through the fog. The glow made the river look alive again, a winding serpent of fire running through the city's frozen heart. In that strange light, the fair grew louder. Ale flowed freely, dice rattled across tables made from old doors, and laughter echoed through the stillness like defiance. Somewhere, a preacher climbed a barrel and shouted that the world was ending, that God had turned the river to ice as a warning. Few listened. The music drowned him out. By midnight, the Frost Fair had become its own city, a ghostly reflection of London above. There were taverns and gambling dens, food stalls and fortune-tellers, even a printing press, stamping broadsheets onto the ice itself. A merry winter upon the Thames, one read, the ink freezing before it dried. The letters glittered under torchlight like tiny mirrors, and yet, for all its mirth, the fair carried a hush at its edges, a kind of reverence. People spoke of hearing strange creaks beneath their feet, of feeling the river breathe in the night. But they stayed, because for once, London's poor stood level with its lords. For once, the cold had made equals of them all, and so they danced upon death, unaware that the ice was already beginning to whisper back. By the end of the first week, the fair was in full bloom, laughter, smoke, and song rising over a city made of frost. But across the river, far from the coloured tents and tinkling glasses, the silence was heavier. In the narrow rows of Whitechapel and Southwark, the frost was not a novelty, it was a sentence. Here, there were no roasted chestnuts, no ribbons for sale, no music on the wind, only the dull sound of wood splintering as doors and fences were torn apart for kindling. In a single-room tenement on Lambeth Street, a woman named Ellen Hughes knelt before a small iron grate. The coals inside had gone white hours ago, but she still cupped her hands toward the dead embers, as if memory alone could draw back the heat. Around her, her children slept or pretended to. Their breath puffed faintly in the cold, drifting through the dark like small, frightened spirits. The youngest had wrapped his feet in strips of old newspaper. The ink had bled into his skin. On the table, a loaf of bread sat hard as a brick. Ellen struck it with the handle of a knife to break it open. The sound rang through the room like hammer on stone. She divided the fragments into 4 pieces and placed them into the children's hands. "Chew slow," she whispered, though she knew it wouldn't matter. The bread tasted of nothing. The hunger beneath it was louder than the wind. Outside, a milkman passed with his cart, the bottles clinking like icicles. The milk inside had frozen solid, rising in pale columns that cracked the glass. A constable on patrol knocked at doors, checking for the dead. It was not cruelty that made him so brisk, only familiarity. Every street in the East End had begun to keep its tally. In some corners, men worked together to carry out the bodies, stacking them in the churchyard until the ground thawed enough to bury them. Meanwhile, the papers still printed stories of joy upriver, mirth and merriment upon the Thames, a festival of ice. The newsboys shouted them with blue lips, running through the snow in rags. Few could afford a penny to buy one, but the headlines travelled by word of mouth. The rich toasted their courage at the Frost Fair, while the poor burned the legs of chairs. As night fell, the fog returned, thicker now, curling down the alleys like breath from an unseen mouth. Frost edged the windows, sealing the cracks that let in what little air there was. Ellen pulled the children close, listening to the distant roar of the fair, that strange laughter rising above a city half dead from cold. She wondered how far sound could travel over ice. On the wall above the grate hung a small framed print of a river, a summer river, full of sailboats and sunlight. The glass over it had cracked from the cold, a white line running through the heart of the water. Ellen stared at it until her eyes blurred. She tried to remember warmth, not as comfort, but as color, the yellow of butter, the red of a child's cheeks, the gold of morning. But color was a luxury now. The wind pressed against the door, sighing through the seams. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then stopped. The sound of the river came faintly through the walls, not moving, not singing, just the deep, slow pulse of something vast and cold. The Thames no longer fed the city. It held it, quiet and captive, beneath the weight of its own silence. It began before dawn, a thin column of smoke rising from the riverward quarter of Street Giles, almost invisible against the grey. By the time anyone noticed, it was already too late. The poorhouse, a sagging timber building that had endured a century of neglect, had caught fire. The frost had locked the doors in place. The water pumps were frozen solid. Within minutes, the flames had leapt from roof to roof, bright as a wound against the sleeping city. They said it started with a coal dropped from a cracked stove, or perhaps a spark from the kitchen grate. But no one could be certain, for the woman who tended that stove was already gone, trapped by the same ice that had numbed her feet for days. Those who managed to escape described it as something both beautiful and monstrous. The way the fire glowed blue at its edges, feeding on walls stiff with frost. It hissed, it crackled, it sang, and above that strange, greedy chorus came the cries of those still inside. Londoners woke too, the sight of flame reflected on the snow. They ran through the streets, half-dressed, their breath white in the bitter air. Men carried buckets from the nearest pump, only to find the handles encased in ice. The river, once the city's lifeline, lay useless and hard, mocking them. In desperation, they broke through the ice with shovels, filling pails with chunks of frozen water that melted too slowly to matter. The fire didn't care. It climbed the poorhouse walls, turning the frost itself into steam. Inside, the heat and cold fought a terrible battle. Frost cracked from the rafters like gunfire. Windows shattered outward, showering the street with glittering shards. A woman was seen at one, her hair streaming behind her like smoke before she fell, her body landing in snow so white it seemed merciful. By sunrise, the poorhouse was gone. Nothing remained but a blackened frame and a few twisted pots of iron that had once been the kitchen. Around the ruins, the poor gathered for warmth, their faces lit by the smouldering glow. Some held their hands toward the embers, desperate for the heat that had killed their neighbors. Children picked through the ash for unburned scraps of wood, the only thing of value left. The air smelled of soot and salt, the scent of survival, sour and holy. The frost did not leave after that morning. It deepened. The fire had eaten the last of the neighborhood's kindling, leaving the survivors with nothing but ruin. By evening, the ash that drifted through the streets froze where it fell, turning the black cinders white. The poorhouse was gone, but its shape remained a pale outline against the sky, like a memory that refused to melt. Across the river, the frost fair still glittered, tents swayed in the wind, and laughter carried faintly on the air, though no one at Street Giles could hear it now. For them, the fire had been both curse and blessing. It had taken their shelter, but given them, for one fleeting hour, warmth enough to remember what living felt like. That night, when the smoke finally cleared, a thin sheet of ice formed over the ruins. The moon caught in it, trembling, as if unsure whether to shine on the dead or the living. London slept uneasily, wrapped in cold and the echo of flame, while beneath it all, the river murmured on, silent, blind, and waiting. At the edge of Westminster Bridge, where the fog thickened until it felt like breath itself, a man stood with his easel. His name was Thomas Latch, though no one in the city remembered it. He was a painter of the common sort, too poor for patrons, too proud for trade. He had painted the Thames in all her moods before, green with rain, black with soot, golden with sunset, but never like this. Never when she was still. He had come before dawn, dragging his supplies across the frozen cobbles. The oil in his lamp was nearly spent, its flame fluttering in the wind. Beneath him, the river was a mirror hard and perfect, so clear that the first blue of morning seemed to glow from below. He stood for a long time without moving, only watching as the frost crept over the rails, turning the iron pale as bone. His hands trembled when he finally lifted the brush, not from fear but from cold. The bristles had stiffened overnight, and the paint, once smooth as cream, had turned sluggish, reluctant to yield. He painted what he saw, a city half buried in its own breath, chimneys sending up thin plumes that froze into icicles mid-air, barges locked in place, their hulls rimed with frost, figures moving like ghosts between the tents of the frost, fair tiny strokes of colour, flashes of red shawls and black coats against the endless grey. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck 8, dull and heavy, its sound swallowed by the fog. A child appeared beside him, a boy with a cap too large for his head and boots that left wet trails on the bridge. He watched the painter silently for a while before speaking. "Is it true," he asked, "that the river's dead?" Thomas smiled faintly, his breath clouding the air. "Not dead," he said, "just sleeping." The boy nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "My mum says the ice'll crack and swallow us all." The painter dipped his brush again. "Then best we paint it before it does." By midday, his fingers had gone numb. He worked anyway, blotting his canvas with blue-grey light and thin shadows of smoke. People passed without noticing him, merchants hurrying to the fair, beggars seeking warmth, lovers walking hand in hand beneath the trembling lamps. He caught them all, one by one, like fleeting ghosts in a frozen dream. When the sun broke through at last, weak and white as a candle behind glass, he stepped back to look. The Thames stared back at him not as water, but as memory. His painting shimmered faintly in the light, the colours muted, almost tender. He knew it would never sell. The world did not pay for stillness. That evening, as he packed his brushes, a sound rose from the ice below, a deep, hollow crack that echoed through the arches of the bridge. It was the kind of sound that split the air without warning, the river's low warning sigh. The boy had been right to fear it. But Thomas only smiled, the frost catching in his beard. He felt a strange peace, as if he had witnessed something sacred, a city held between life and death, beauty and ruin. When he left the bridge, the fog followed him, curling around his figure like smoke. His painting remained, drying slowly in the cold, the river on the canvas just as it was beneath his feet, frozen, silent, and infinite. By the second week of the frost, even the taverns, London's last bastions of warmth and song, began to surrender. The great barrels of ale, once the pride of every publican from Southwark to Holborn, had split like ripe fruit. The liquid inside had swollen with ice, bursting their hoops and spilling thick amber crystals across the floors. The smell of beer lingered in the air, sweet, sour, and sad like the ghost of merriment that had fled. At the Boar and Whistle on Fish Street Hill, the landlord, Mr. Pullen, stood over the wreck of his cellar. The frost had taken it all: ale, gin, wine, and even the weak cider meant for the servants. He kicked at the frozen floorboards and cursed the heavens, though his words came out in a cloud of white mist. The few patrons who still came sat close to the hearth, their hands stretched out, nursing mugs of whatever could still be poured. It wasn't drink that brought them any more, it was the fire. Outside, the air itself seemed to gnaw. Men wrapped scarves around their faces until they looked like ghosts with hollow eyes. Their boots struck sparks from the frozen cobbles, and in every alley the wind howled like something living. Bakers complained that their ovens cracked from the heat meeting the frost. Butchers found their cleavers stuck fast in blocks of meat. The market near Billingsgate was silent, save for the groan of the ice beneath the fishmongers' carts, every haddock and cod as stiff as stone, their eyes glazed in little domes of ice. In the poorer wards, the frost took on a slower cruelty. The smell of hunger grew sharp and metallic, like iron left out in the rain. At night, whole families gathered in doorways or beneath bridges, their fires no bigger than a candle flame. Mothers stirred pots that held only water and a scrap of bone, pretending the smell alone could quiet the children's stomachs. The city had learned to lie gently to itself, to call starvation thrift, to call freezing patience. Up on Ludgate Hill, the wealthier quarters fared little better. The pipes froze, the coal wagons stalled, and servants, once invisible, now shared the same cold as their masters. Lady Fairborn, whose husband had fled to Bath weeks earlier, sat wrapped in fox furs beside a window thick with frost. Through it, she watched the river shining like glass, the tiny figures moving across it like shadows on a mirror. Her tea cooled before she could drink it. Her maid had burned the last of the furniture in the nursery to keep the room warm. Still, there were pockets of laughter. On the river, the frost fair burned bright with its stubborn joy, a place where gin was traded for smiles, and where men toasted to endurance. But the ale was thinning there too. The kegs stood like tombs beneath the stalls, each one frozen solid. When someone managed to pry open a lid, the drink came out like syrup, thick and bitter on the tongue. They drank anyway. That night, a silence fell heavier than before. The taverns darkened, their doors bolted against the cold. Those inside slept with their boots still on, afraid to face what waited outside. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, the faint creak of the river could be heard again, slow, patient, endless. London's belly was empty, its throat dry, and its pulse faint beneath the frost. The laughter of the fair was fading now, like a lantern burning low. The city was learning what hunger sounded like when even ale had turned to ice. When the frost deepened to its cruelest pitch, the city's children took to the river as if it were theirs. The grown men hesitated, fearful of cracks, of omens, of the slow groan of the Thames beneath its white shroud, but the young felt no such weight. To them, the ice was not a warning but a playground, vast and glittering, stretching from shore to shore. They were small enough that the river did not yet fear their steps. From dawn until dusk, they slid over the frozen water, on scraps of wood or strips of leather torn from their shoes. Their laughter carried through the fog, bright and piercing, echoing between the bridges like a hymn to the season. Bare hands struck at snowflakes that fell like ashes. Some wore stockings for gloves, others nothing at all. They built small forts from chunks of river ice, christening them with names borrowed from castles and kingdoms they had only heard about in the market songs. No one owned them, not truly. They came from the alleys, the tenements, from doorways where mothers once warmed their hands over candle stubs. Some had no parents left at all. They knew the taste of stale bread and the ache of empty bellies, but on the Thames they were free. The river was their field, their game, their temporary escape from hunger. When the sun broke through the haze, turning the frost to silver, they danced as though it were spring. A few of the fair's merchants took pity on them. A baker's wife tossed them the ends of her loaves, hard as stones but devoured quickly. One printer set up a small press on the ice, stamping crude cards that read, "Souvenir of the Great Frost." He paid the children a farthing each to hand them to passing gentry. They lined up with blue fingers, grinning through cracked lips, proud to be part of something bigger than their misery. But the river was not gentle. At night, when the fair emptied and the lamps went out one by one, the cold pressed close again. The children would crawl beneath the wooden stalls, huddled together like birds beneath a dying tree. The sound of the ice moving in the dark, that slow, stretching groan, filled their dreams. Sometimes one of them did not wake. When that happened, the others said nothing. They would carry the small body to the edge, where the fog was thickest, and let the river take it back. By morning, no trace remained. Still, they came. Each day, more of them, pale as frost and light as shadows. They chased each other through the smoke of cooking fires, skated between the hooves of horses, vanished into the white distance where the river met the sky. The city had forgotten them, but the ice remembered every footstep, every small weight upon its back. One evening, as the lamps flickered low and the sound of fiddles drifted from a tavern tent, a group of boys lit a candle in the center of their fort. a single flame against the vast cold. They watched it shiver, then go out. The oldest, no more than 12, said softly, "That's how long we'll last too." The others nodded, not in fear but in understanding. For a moment the wind stilled, and the river seemed to listen. Beneath their feet it shifted ever so slightly, a whisper through the ice, deep and patient, like the heartbeat of something ancient that would not pity them, but would remember. In Mayfair and Westminster, where the houses stood high and proud above the choking fog, the frost was not an enemy, but a spectacle. Behind panes of thick glass and velvet curtains, the wealthy gathered to watch their city freeze. Their chimneys still smoked, their servants still shoveled coal into roaring grates, and the cold, while sharp, never truly reached them. Yet even in their warmth, they could not look away from what the frost had done to the world beyond. In one such house on Grosvenor Square, Lady Adeline Pembroke sat by her drawing-room window wrapped in ermine and silk. A tray of chocolate cooled at her side, untouched, its surface filmed with ice before the maid could bring it back to the fire. Outside, the gas lamps along the street flickered like distant stars, their halos blurred by fog. Beyond that fog, she could hear it, the faint hum of life on the frozen Thames. Laughter, shouts, the clink of glass, the slow thunder of drums from the frost fair. It was all so terribly romantic. Her husband, Sir Robert, thought so too. He had even ordered a sleigh, a fine one, with bells along the harness and silver runners polished like mirrors to carry them down to the river. He meant to show her the fair, to let her see the spirit of London with her own eyes. But when the footman returned shivering and pale, saying that the ice groaned beneath the horses and the poor pressed too close to beg, the idea lost its charm. The sleigh sat in the courtyard, half buried in snow, the silver dulled to grey. In the great houses, the servants whispered among themselves. Fires burned day and night, but still frost crept across the window panes and licked at the walls. The kitchen steamed with boiling pots and copper kettles, but upstairs, the mirrors clouded with every breath. Some of the maids slept beside their hearths to keep the pipes from freezing. Others froze where they stood, their hands raw from carrying scuttles of coal. Yet when the bells called for service, they straightened their uniforms and smiled, for the cold was not theirs to mention. At dinner, gentlemen discussed the frost in tones of admiration, like connoisseurs praising a rare wine. They spoke of how the Dutch had long celebrated their winters with fairs upon the canals, how the cold made men hearty and trade brisk. They quoted poets who compared ice to purity, snow to grace, but beneath the table, even their boots felt the chill. From her window, Lady Adeline watched the breath of the city rise in grey clouds. She imagined the poor laughing on the ice, imagined bonfires and ribbons and warm ale. She preferred not to think of the ones who did not laugh, the families who burned their doors for heat, the children who vanished when the fog grew too thick. Beauty was easier to bear than truth. When night came, she drew the curtains closed, shutting out the sight of the frost fair's lights flickering in the distance. The room dimmed to gold and shadow. A harp played softly in the parlour, and for a moment she could almost forget the world outside. But later, when she rose to bed, she found frost blooming along the glass, again a pattern delicate as lace, curling across the window like a frozen sigh. She touched it with her gloved hand and felt nothing. Below, on the street, a beggar woman sang for pennies, her voice faint beneath the whine of the wind. Lady Adeline hesitated, then turned away. The fire had burned low, the frost climbed higher on the glass, and beyond it, the city lay silent, a kingdom of ice that belonged to no one. By the third Sunday of the great frost, the smoke above the river had become its own kind of weather. It drifted low and heavy, a moving fog of ash and cinder that blurred the line between heaven and earth. The Thames lay hidden beneath it, more rumour than river, a silent highway of ice glowing faintly in the murk. From the bridges, one could see only the flicker of firelight through the haze. 1,000 tiny bonfires scattered like fallen stars. Each flame marked a stall, a tent, a soul trying to stay alive beneath the iron breath of winter. The frost fair had grown thick with bodies by then, tradesmen, beggars, soldiers, gamblers, sailors, all drawn to the strange warmth of the crowd. The air hummed with the sound of hammers striking nails into ice, voices bargaining, fiddles scraping through the cold. Somewhere near Blackfriars, a butcher roasted eels over an open flame, their skins hissing as the grease met the frost. Children darted between the fires selling roasted chestnuts, their hands blackened by soot, their faces alight with something halfway between hunger and joy. But the smoke carried more than the scent of food. It carried the memory of what had been lost, the timber of burned doors, the cloth of ruined furniture, the resin of coffins torn from graveyards to feed the flames. Everything that could burn was burning. Even the frozen river itself seemed to sigh beneath the weight of it, the ice crackling softly like a whisper beneath the smoke. Farther upriver, near Temple Stairs, the painter Thomas Latch returned to his bridge with his half-finished canvas. He set his easel once more, though the cold had made his fingers nearly useless. The smoke swallowed him, curling around his shoulders as he worked. From where he stood, London was only a blur of light golden dots trembling in the mist, like lanterns seen through tears. He dipped his brush into black and grey, then into white, painting the ghost of a city more than the city itself. Across the water, church bells rang dull, uncertain, their tones muffled by the fog. The faithful still came, trudging through snow to whisper prayers for deliverance. Yet even in the chapels, the air was thick with smoke, the holy candles burning low and sickly. The city prayed through choking lungs. By nightfall, the bonfires on the Thames grew larger. Men dragged broken carts, barrels, even stair rails onto the ice to keep the flames alive. The smoke rose in twisting columns, staining the stars. It clung to hair, to wool, to the insides of mouths. It made every breath taste faintly of iron. And still the people stayed dancing, drinking, singing hoarse songs to drive the silence away. From the bank, the sight was unreal. The river gleaming faintly beneath its shroud of smoke, fires burning atop it as if the Thames itself were aflame. To those who watched, it looked almost like salvation, a vision of life floating above death. But beneath the ice, the river still moved, dark and patient. And when the fires burned too long in one place, the ice began to sigh again, low, deep, and dangerous, as if warning those who danced that warmth, like everything else that winter, would come at a cost. In the days to come, Londoners would remember that sound, the slow, distant groaning beneath the smoke, and say it was the river's voice, calling for the living to step lightly. Few heeded it. The flames were bright, and the cold was endless, and the people of London had learned to mistake danger for warmth. By the fourth week of the frost, the Thames no longer looked like a river at all. It had become a town, a sprawling, crooked marketplace of canvas tents, bonfires, and makeshift stalls that stretched from bank to bank. People called it the River Market, though others still preferred the grander name, the Frost Fair. Whatever one called it, it was London's new heart, beating slow and strange beneath the grey sky. At dawn, the smoke from 100 fires rose straight into the still air, turning the horizon to pewter. The river groaned under the weight of it all, the stalls selling pies and ale, the fortune-tellers' booths painted with stars, the wooden swings and crude gambling tables carved from planks torn off the docks. A man could walk from the Whitefriars to the Southwark shore without ever touching land, his boots crunching on ice thick as stone. The Thames, that old restless serpent, lay bound and silent, her surface now carved with footprints, spilled gin, and the faint traces of skates. Merchants who once sold in Covent Garden or Smithfield now stood elbow to elbow on the ice, wrapped in wool and ambition. Here, money flowed easier than water had. There were roasted apples and goose, beer poured steaming from kettles, and ribbons bright as blood. Perfume sellers spritzed the air with lavender and rosewater that froze into glassy petals before it landed. One could buy anything: books, buttons, charms, or sins. A man named Jasper Pike sold miracles. He had set up a table near the middle of the river, 2 candles and a scrap of painted cloth that read, "The Ice Seer." For a penny, he would read your fortune by the shape of cracks in the ice beneath your feet. Lovers queued for it, laughing as they leaned close to hear his prophecies. He told one woman her husband would return safely from sea before spring, though he could already see in the pattern below that the ice was splitting toward her boots. The market thrummed with life, carts creaked, fiddlers scraped their strings, and the air rang with the clatter of coins and laughter. But beneath the noise, a stillness remained, patient and immense. The river's surface seemed to pulse faintly in places, like breath caught under glass. Some swore they could hear it moving far below, the slow crush and shift of water under the frozen crust, waiting for its chance to rise again. By afternoon, a procession of gentlemen from Parliament arrived, bundled in furs, eager to see this miracle of nature. They strode past the stalls, smiling at the spectacle, the poor playing at prosperity, the rich playing at daring. One of them bought a printed sheet that read, "The Wonders of the Frost Fair of 1814. The ink froze on his gloves. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit and hung on poles, their light trembling over the ice like constellations come down to earth. The laughter rose again, mingling with the rattle of dice and the faint creak of the river below. Man might almost forget the hunger in his belly, the cold in his bones. Almost. But when the wind shifted from the east, the illusion broke. The fires flickered, and somewhere, near the far bend by Blackfriars, came a low crack, long, deep, deliberate. It rolled through the crowd like thunder underfoot. The fiddles stopped. A woman screamed. Then silence, broken only by the sound of the river closing her throat again. No one spoke of it afterward. The market continued, the laughter returned, and the night swallowed the sound. But the ice had begun to change. The cracks beneath Jasper Pike's feet deepened, and though the candles on his table still burned bright, their flames bent low, trembling as if they, too, could feel the river breathing again. He appeared out of the fog one morning, a man with a wooden cart, an old monkey in a red waistcoat, and a music box that sang against the silence. The frost fair was already stirring to life. Fires rekindled, ale boiled in kettles, and voices drifted through the grey. But when the first notes of his song echoed across the ice, everything seemed to pause. The tune was slow, lilting, and strangely tender, a melody too soft for such a cruel season. He called himself Carlo, though no one knew if that was his name. His face was hidden beneath a scarf, and his hands were wrapped in rags to keep them from splitting. The monkey sat on his shoulder like a small, watchful ghost, its tail curled beneath his collar for warmth. When Carlo turned the crank, the organ wheezed to life, thin pipes singing through the cold, each note trembling in the still air. Children gathered first, their laughter faint and brittle. Then came the merchants and the gamblers, drawn by the sound that carried, above the crack of ice and the mutter of trade. The song wound its way across the river, simple but haunting. It rose and fell like the tide used to, when the Thames was alive. Some said it was an Italian lullaby. Others swore it was a funeral march slowed to half its pace. Whatever it was, it made people stop. For a few moments, the market stilled, no dice clattering, no haggling voices, no firewood splitting, only the thin music, breathing through frost and fog. Carlo moved slowly from bridge to bridge, his wheels squeaking on the ice. He played near the stalls selling roasted chestnuts, where the smoke curled into halos above his head. A soldier tossed him a copper, then asked for a song from home. Carlo nodded, turned the crank again, and played something bright and clumsy that made the soldier laugh, though his eyes filled as he did. By noon, his monkey had learned the rhythm of the market. It leapt from the cart to collect coins, darting between boots and skirts, its small paws black with soot. People smiled when they saw it. They needed to smile. In a season that had taken warmth from every corner of the city, even the sound of a broken organ could feel like a miracle. But when dusk fell, and the fair's lights began to blur behind fog, Carlo changed his tune. The melody deepened, mournful now, as if the ice itself were singing. The monkey sat still, its red coat stiff with frost. Those who lingered near his cart said the music made their throats ache, though they couldn't say why. It was as if the song remembered something the living had forgotten, a warmth, a voice, a river that once spoke. He vanished that night. When the fires were lit again the next morning, the organ was found half buried near a crack in the ice, its pipes frozen solid. The monkey was gone. Some said Carlo had gone through the ice, swallowed by the river he had serenaded. Others said he walked off into the fog and kept playing somewhere the living couldn't hear. Yet now and then, when the wind turned from the south, those who walked the river's edge swore they heard it again, that same soft tune drifting from beneath the bridges. Not loud, not long, just enough to make the lamps flicker, the frost quiver, and the city remember, for one shivering moment, what silence sounded like before the music began. The frost had claimed many quietly in beds, in doorways, in silence. But one January morning, death took to the streets. It began with a single woman, found collapsed in an alley off Fleet Street, her shawl frozen to her shoulders, her body stiff beneath the pale dawn light. A dustman discovered her when he came to clear the ash from the street furnaces. At first, he thought she was sleeping. The frost made her look peaceful, the lashes rimmed with silver, the mouth half open, as if she were breathing the cold instead of fighting it. But when he bent down to wake her, the ice cracked around her skirts like glass, and he saw her eyes. The city was accustomed to the dead. It had learned to walk past them without looking. Yet that morning, the crowd that gathered did not move on. The woman was young, no more than 30, her hands small and white, the left still clutching a scrap of bread. The frost had preserved her like a portrait. Even the curl of her hair beneath her bonnet was intact, as though she had been caught mid-movement, a candle snuffed before the flame bent. Someone fetched a constable, who came stamping through the snow, his breath billowing like steam. He crouched beside her, touching her wrist with 2 gloved fingers, though he must have known she was long past warmth. "Another one," he muttered. "That's the 3rd this week in this quarter." He straightened, glanced at the faces around him, merchants, errand boys, a printer's apprentice, a flower girl with a basket of frozen violets. No one spoke. Only the wind did, threading between them, lifting the woman's shawl as if to carry her away. A priest arrived soon after, called from the nearby church. He crossed himself and began to pray, though his voice faltered in the cold. When he reached the line about mercy, the words hung in the air, turning to frost before they reached the ground. Someone wept quietly. Another man turned away, muttering about the price of coal. The city did not stop for death. It folded it into its rhythm, like the toll of distant bells. They carried her to the parish yard on a borrowed cart, the wheels groaning against the ice. The dustman followed, hat in hand, his eyes lowered. The priest walked ahead, his breath marking the path like incense. Passers-by paused to watch, not out of pity, but recognition. They all saw a reflection of themselves in her stillness. When night fell, the alley where she died froze solid again. The ground glittered where her body had lain, as though the frost itself had tried to keep her. The constable ordered a small heap of straw spread over the spot, but by morning the wind had swept it away. All that remained was a dark stain on the cobblestones and the faint scent of bread. For weeks afterward, those who passed that corner claimed to see her shadow. Some said it was the fog. Others swore the frost there never melted, not even when the thaw came. But the truth was simpler, and colder she was, one of thousands. The frost had turned London into a vast, open grave, and death was no longer something to hide behind curtains. It walked openly now, pale and silent, down every street, waiting for those too tired to run. And somewhere deep beneath the river, the ice shifted again, a slow, echoing sigh. as if the Thames itself mourned one more name it would never learn. The churches of London had never been so full, nor so cold. In every parish, from Southwark to Holborn, the bells tolled through fog thick as wool, their muffled notes rolling over the river and breaking against the ice. People came, not because they believed deliverance was near, but because it was the only place left where breath and hope could gather together under a roof. The city's poor shuffled in early, leaving tracks of grey slush across the stone floors. They carried their children wrapped in blankets, their faces pale as the wax saints that watched from the alcoves. Inside Street Dunstans, the air smelled of damp wool, tallow smoke, and fear. Candles guttered along the altar, their flames too weak to reach the high arches above. The frost had crept even into the holy water fonts, sealing them over with a thin crust that the priest broke each morning with the edge of his chalice. The crack echoed through the nave like a gunshot. When the water thawed, it shimmered with flakes of ice, a fragile blessing in a season without mercy. Father Mallory's hands shook as he lifted the host, his breath clouded before his face, his voice came out in wisps. "Deliver us from evil," he whispered, though his lips were almost blue. Behind him the crucifix glittered faintly, frost forming along the nails and the crown of thorns. It looked, in that dim light, as though even Christ himself were freezing. The congregation knelt, the sound of cloth and bone on stone. They prayed for warmth, for bread, for one more day of air that did not burn their lungs. Some wept softly, others simply stared ahead, their eyes glassy with exhaustion. Outside, the wind scraped at the church doors like a beast locked out. Each time it howled, the candles trembled, and the faces of the saints on the stained glass flickered in and out of sight. Saints who had lived through plagues, through wars, through floods, but none had ever lived through this. In a pew near the back, an old woman clutched a rosary so tightly that the beads cut into her palms. Blood dotted her knuckles, bright as berries against the grey light. She whispered the same prayer over and over until her lips turned white. "Spare the little ones." Her grandson lay beside her on the floor, asleep or faint, his breath so faint it left no mark in the air. When the priest passed by with his censer, the smoke froze in the cold and fell like ash. When Mass ended, no one left. The church had become a shelter, people huddled together between pews, their bodies pressed close for heat. The poor shared crusts of bread, the wealthy left coins on the altar, as if gold could bribe the frost. The organist tried to play, but the pipes were clogged with ice. The music strangled before it could rise. That night, Father Mallory kept the doors open. He knew if he closed them, the wind would claim whoever lingered outside. So he let the beggars and the lost ones come in, their footsteps echoing against the stone. They slept at the foot of the altar, beneath the frozen gaze of angels. From time to time, one would wake and whisper a prayer into the silence, but heaven did not answer. Only the rafters creaked, and the wind moaned softly through the cracks in the walls, carrying the sound of the river in its breath. And somewhere between those echoes, between the murmur of prayers and the shifting of the ice, London learned a new kind of worship, not of faith or forgiveness, but of endurance. Each dawn that arrived was a miracle, and each breath was an act of defiance against the cold. On the morning of the 12th of February, the bell at St. Paul's Cathedral froze. It had tolled every dawn since the frost began, slow, deep, defiant, a sound that rolled through the grey fog and reminded the living they had survived another night. But that morning, when the verger pulled the rope, nothing happened. The bell did not move. The hemp snapped with a dry crack, and the sound that followed was not a chime but a hollow thud, as though London's heart had stopped mid-beat. The cold had climbed the great cathedral like ivy, clinging to every ledge and arch. Frost gathered in the crevices of the stone until the entire dome gleamed with pale crystals. Inside, the air hung motionless. Each breath drifted upward in ghostly wisps, dissolving among the columns. The wooden pews were rimed with frost that glittered faintly when the first grey light crept through the windows. The stained glass, too, had changed. Its saints looked pale and lifeless now, their colours leached by the cold. At the base of the tower, two bellmen stood staring up at the silent bronze giant. Its edges were white with ice, its tongue sealed to the side as if silenced by some invisible hand. "Never seen the like," one muttered, rubbing his palms. The other only nodded. They both knew that when the bell froze, it was more than just metal. Locking tight, it was a sign. London's voice had gone quiet. Outside, the frost fair continued, but even its laughter seemed dimmer that day. The fires burned low, their smoke curling upward like prayers that could not find heaven. In the streets around Ludgate Hill, carts creaked over the frozen ruts, their wheels whispering through the silence. The air carried the faint smell of soot and candle wax, the scent of endurance, of things barely holding on. The clergy of St. Paul's gathered at noon to attempt a remedy. They built braziers around the base of the tower, feeding them with broken pews and old hymnals. The flames licked at the stone, leaving black streaks like fingerprints of desperation. Up in the belfry, the younger men chipped at the ice with hammers, each blow ringing dull and heavy. It took hours before the first crack appeared, a faint line of dark bronze beneath the frost. One of them, a boy of 16, reached out to touch it, and when he did, the ice broke free in a single sheet, falling and shattering against the steps below like glass. The bell did not toll again that day. The priests said it must rest, that the metal had been weakened, that forcing it would cause it to split. But others whispered that it had refused to ring, that it knew the sound of death had already become too common in the streets. That evening, as dusk settled over the dome, the bellmen stood in the tower once more. They said nothing. Through the narrow slits in the wall, they could see the city stretched out below, a labyrinth of chimneys and frost, smoke rising from the river like ghosts. The fires of the fair flickered faintly in the distance, mirrored by the glow of candles in countless windows. London looked peaceful from that height, almost holy. But the men knew better. They could feel the cold through the soles of their boots, seeping upward, relentless. When midnight came, a strange sound filled the air, not a bell, not a human voice, but a long, low groan that rolled across the rooftops. It was the ice shifting on the Thames, cracking under its own weight. The men turned toward the window, listening. For a moment, it sounded almost like the bell itself, a frozen echo, a mourning note carried by the wind, and then it faded, leaving only silence behind. By dawn, frost had climbed the tower again, wrapping the bell in white. And from that day forward, the people of London said that when St. Paul's refused to speak, it was not silence they heard, it was the river listening. He worked alone, near the bend of the river where the frost was clearest, and the crowds thinned at dusk. His name was rarely spoken. Some called him the engraver, others the frost scribe. No one knew where he slept, only that he appeared each morning with a chisel, a small hammer, and a flask of water that steamed faintly when opened. He did not sell food or trinkets like the others. He sold remembrance. His stall was nothing more than a low bench and a slab of ice cut from the river itself. Upon it he carved names. For a penny he would chip a loved one's name into a block of frozen glass, delicate as lace. Some brought the names of the living, a father at sea, a child taken to the fever ward as if freezing the letters could keep them safe. Others brought names of the dead, whispered through trembling lips, the syllables turning to vapor in the cold before reaching his ears. The engraver never asked which. He simply nodded, bent his head, and began. The sound of his work was strangely soothing. Tap, 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 a rhythm steady as prayer. His hands were raw and cracked, the nails darkened by the cold, yet his lines were sure. He worked with the patience of someone who had already made peace with silence. The letters shimmered beneath his chisel, each one catching the pale light of the fires that burned along the river. When the names were finished, he would rinse them with his steaming flask, sealing them smooth. For a brief moment, they looked alive, glowing softly in the frost, like captured breath. People lingered after the work was done, staring at the names as though they might speak. But ice is a jealous keeper. By morning, the blocks would cloud and melt, the letters slipping back into the river. It was said that the engraver would rise before dawn to gather the fragments, casting them beneath the ice with a whispered blessing. "So they won't be forgotten," a boy once heard him say. No one knew where he found his ice, for his slabs were always flawless, clear as glass, untouched by soot or cracks. Some swore he cut them from the heart of the river at night, when the fog was thickest and the moon hung low like a coin in a beggar's hand. Others claimed he had once been a mason at St. Paul's, carving angels before his hands stiffened in the cold. Whatever his past, his present belonged to the frost. One evening, a woman brought him the name of her husband, lost weeks earlier when a section of the ice gave way near the fair. She handed him her last coin, and as he carved, tears froze on her cheeks. When he finished, she asked if the ice would last until spring. He looked up, his eyes grey as the river. "Nothing lasts until spring," he said gently, "but the river remembers everything." The next morning, his stall was empty, the bench was gone, and where his table had been, the ice was cracked in a perfect rectangle, as if lifted clean away. People searched for him, but the fog swallowed all trace. That night, as the fires burned low and the wind swept down from the north, the river glittered faintly under the moon. Beneath the surface, names shimmered like stars caught in glass, too many to count, too many to forget. Some say he had carved them all himself in the end, one by one, until his chisel slipped and the river took him too. Others believe he left when his task was done, his breath frozen into the ice he loved. But on the coldest nights, when the Thames moans under its weight, Londoners still claim to see faint letters glowing through the frost, the work of the engraver, the keeper of names, whose art was carved not in stone or canvas, but in silence and loss. When the frost first came, the city drank to forget. By the second month, it drank to survive. Every tavern from Limehouse to Ludgate became a chapel of its own kind, smoky, loud, and full of desperate prayers slurred through cracked lips. Gin was cheaper than coal, and far warmer. The poor drank it like medicine. The rich drank it like absolution. It was mercy in a bottle, and London knelt before it. At the sign of the Plough, a low-beamed tavern near the river stairs, the cold gathered with the customers. Frost crept along the bottles behind the bar, painting each one in a thin white veil. The air inside was heavy with the smell of spirits and wet wool. The fire in the hearth burned low, but no one cared. The drink was heat enough. Dockworkers, seamstresses, thieves, widows, all sat shoulder to shoulder, their differences erased by the same thirst. The sound of their cups against the wood made a rhythm that almost felt like life. Behind the counter, the barkeep, a heavy man named Harlan Wicks, poured gin into tin mugs without looking. He had long since stopped measuring. When the frost took his wife, he'd closed the shutters for 3 days, then reopened them with a new rule: no one drinks alone. He said it kept the ghosts out. People laughed, but they came. By candlelight, his tavern became a sanctuary, half confessional, half grave. A girl named Maisie sat near the door, wrapped in a coat that wasn't hers. Her fingers were blue around her cup. She'd been a maid once, until the house she served in burned its last logs and turned her out. Now she worked for Harlan, scrubbing the floor in the mornings and pouring gin at night. She drank as she worked, small sips that stung her lips but kept her heart moving. "It's mercy, this," she said once to a stranger. "The kind that burns before it saves." The stranger didn't answer. He was staring into the fire, his breath fogging in the dim air. It was said he'd lost his family upriver when the ice first broke, and that he came here every night because the sound of laughter was easier to bear than silence. He raised his mug to no one and whispered, "To the ones who made it halfway." Outside, the wind keened through the streets, rattling the shutters like bones. Somewhere down the lane, a bell rang for evening prayers, though few still went. Inside, the tavern hummed like a living thing, the murmur of voices, the clatter of mugs, the faint tremor of the river, moving beneath the ice. At midnight, the fire finally died. The room dimmed to amber and shadow. Harlan stood behind the counter, polishing a glass with hands that shook. He looked out at the faces slumped against the tables, men and women, rich and poor, strangers all, and for the first time that winter, he felt something close to peace. They were alive, for now, and the frost hadn't found them yet. When morning came, the tavern's windows were white with ice. The street outside was silent, but, within, the tables were still warm from the bodies that had slept there. Harlan opened the shutters and let the light in. For a moment, it looked as though the frost itself was retreating, melting back into the corners, giving way to the faint steam of breath and gin. He smiled, just barely, and whispered into the empty air, "Mercy, enough." Then he reached for a bottle, poured 2 cups, one for himself, one for the cold, and drank until the world blurred. Outside, the frost fair stirred again, the sound of distant laughter echoing faintly over the frozen Thames. It was morning in a city of ghosts, and gin, for another day, had given London the illusion of mercy. The frost had changed the sound of the city. Wheels no longer rumbled on cobblestones, hooves struck sparks on ice. Footsteps came muffled, cautious, as if afraid to disturb the quiet. But one sound still carried the steady, hollow roll of the black coach that came each morning just before dawn. Londoners had learned to listen for it. The coach meant the frost had claimed more. It came from the east, down Ludgate Hill, and through the narrow lanes toward the river. Its driver was always the same, a tall man in a thick wool coat, face hidden beneath a scarf pulled high to his eyes. The horses, thin, spectral things, left no steam in the air. Some said they were illusions, the color of ash and fog, pulling an empty carriage. Others swore they had seen the driver stop to gather the dead, his gloved hands gentle as a priest's. That morning, the frost lay deeper than before. The city still slept under its white burden, chimneys motionless, lamps dim. The black coach rolled silently through it all, the wheels slicing faintly through the crusted snow. It stopped first at an alley off Bishopsgate, where 2 constables stood beside a figure under a tarp. The frost had painted the body silver. The driver said nothing, only nodded once. Together they lifted the shape into the coach. The sound, the dull thump against the wood, vanished into the hush of the dawn. By the time the coach reached the bridge, the sun was rising weakly through the fog, a pale coin without warmth. The driver paused to look out over the river. The frost fair still slept, its stalls ghost-like beneath a skin of hoarfrost. A single flag, tattered, stiff, hung from a tent near the center, frozen mid-flutter. Beneath it, the ice groaned softly, the river's low complaint. He touched his hat, a gesture of respect or warning. It was hard to say which, then cracked the reins. Those who were awake said the coach's wheels left no tracks. Some said it belonged to the parish, sent to collect the poor for burial at Street Pancras Fields. Others claimed it came from nowhere at all, a phantom drawn by the city's endless death. One tavern keeper swore he saw it pass without horses, gliding like a shadow. Another said he heard singing from within a slow hymn, low and distant, as though the dead were praying for the living. By noon, the black coach made its final stop beside the workhouse infirmary at Southwark. The attendants there had long ceased to count the bodies. They loaded them quietly, without words, stacking them carefully inside. The frost made them light, almost graceful. When the last was taken, the driver climbed back to his seat and looked toward the cathedral dome, glinting in the distance. For a moment, the faintest light touched the side of his face, pale, weary, expressionless. Then the coach turned and vanished into the fog. Later that day, children playing near the river found 2 long ruts in the snow leading toward the water's edge. They followed them, laughing, until the tracks simply ended. No hoofprints, no wheel marks, only smooth ice shining in the dusk. When they told their mothers, the women crossed themselves and shut the shutters tight. That night, the frost deepened again, Somewhere in the dark, faint wheels creaked over frozen ground, a rhythm, steady and slow. The black coach was on its way once more, following the same endless path through silence, the city's quiet reaper, gathering what the cold had left behind. And though no one ever saw where it went, the next morning there was always one more empty doorway, one more bed turned cold. Under the wide stone ribs of Blackfriars Bridge, the wind could not reach. That was why they came there, the city's smallest exiles, children too light for the workhouse, too forgotten for the parish rolls. The bridge became their shelter, a hollow of frozen echo and dim light where the frost hung like cobwebs. They called it the Arch, as though giving it a name made it a home. By day, they scavenged the fare. When the fires still burned on the Thames, the children darted between stalls, collecting what others left behind, splinters of wood, half-eaten apples, melted tallow scraped from lanterns. The merchants learned to ignore them. A child with frostbitten fingers was as common as the smoke that rose from the river. They moved in packs of 4 or 5, wrapped in rags, faces blackened with soot, laughter thin and wild. They were everywhere and nowhere at once, the ghosts of London's youngest. At dusk, they returned to the Arch. The older ones brought what they could burn: scraps of paper, straw from carts, bits of rope stiff with ice. The younger ones gathered close as the tiny fires hissed and smoked. It was never enough to thaw them, only to remind their hands what warmth felt like. Their voices echoed softly under the bridge, stories, songs, fragments of rhyme remembered from mothers whose faces they had already forgotten. One of them, a girl called Nellie, was 8 years old but looked 5. Her hair had turned white at the tips from the cold, and her eyes, a sharp blue, caught every flicker of flame. She was the one who kept the others alive. "No sleeping cold," she'd whisper whenever someone began to nod beside the fire. "If you sleep cold, you don't wake." The boys called her the Frost Queen, half in jest, half in awe. When the fires died, it was Nellie who stole up to the streets above to look for more. On one of those nights, she found a doll, its face cracked, its dress torn, but its glass eyes still bright. She brought it back under the bridge and set it near the fire, naming it Mercy. The younger children gathered around it, taking turns holding the doll as though it could bless them. In the flickering light, its smile looked alive, and for a moment the Arch felt almost safe. But the frost was patient. Each night the river crept higher beneath the ice, whispering against the stone. The sound lulled them to sleep, a slow heartbeat, a mother's hum. Then one dawn, the smallest of them did not wake. His hands were folded neatly around the doll, and his breath was gone. Nellie did not cry. She only rose, her face pale in the half-light, and carried him to the edge of the ice. She pushed him gently onto the river, letting the current take him beneath the frost. By noon, the others had gone quiet. They sat beneath the bridge, listening to the faint creaks of the river, the distant laughter of the fair, and the steady drip of melting ice. The fires went out. That night, travellers crossing Blackfriars Bridge swore they heard singing below the thin voices of children, soft and far away, joined by a single girl's whisper, steady and sure. No sleeping cold. It began as a sound, a low, drawn-out groan that rippled beneath the music and laughter of the frost fair. The fiddlers didn't stop playing at first. The dancers didn't stop dancing. The noise could have been anything, the wind under the bridge, a cart shifting on the ice. But then it came again, deeper this time, louder, a sound that seemed to crawl up through the soles of one's feet and into the bones. The Thames, after nearly 2 months of silence, was stirring. That night had been the grandest of the fair. Lanterns hung from poles in long, golden chains that shimmered through the fog. Flags snapped in the wind, their colours frozen stiff. Merchants shouted above the din, hawking roasted chestnuts and gin. Couples glided arm in arm, their laughter sharp and bright against the cold. The air smelled of smoke and sweet tallow, of meat and iron. Some called it the last night of the frost, a farewell celebration for a miracle that could not last. Near the center of the river, a troupe of acrobats performed atop a raised platform of planks and barrels, their silhouettes twisting in the orange glow of firelight. Children threw pennies that froze to the boards before they could be gathered. A preacher nearby shouted about sin and judgment, his voice lost in the noise. The crowd cheered when a young man, drunk, reckless, ran out onto the bare ice, sliding until he fell laughing. His laughter turned to silence when the groan came again. This time, the sound was sharp enough to cut through the music. The fiddler stopped mid-bow. One of the acrobats faltered, landing awkwardly. The preacher's words broke off. Then, all at once, the ice cracked. It wasn't a single break, but a chain reaction, a jagged, thunderous roar that split the fair down its heart. The stalls buckled, the poles shuddered, the lanterns swung wildly as their flames went out. A cry rose from the crowd, 1,000 voices merging into one long note of horror. The river beneath them was waking, and it was hungry. Men ran for the banks, slipping on the tilting surface. Women clutched their children, skirts catching on splinters of ice. Horses screamed and reared, their hooves breaking through to the water below. In seconds, the fair became a battlefield, wood collapsing, ropes snapping, bodies sliding into black water. The fog that had once been gentle now turned cruel, swallowing faces and names as people vanished into it. At Blackfriars, the ice held just long enough for a handful to reach the shore. They turned back and saw the fires falling one by one into the cracks, their reflections scattering across the river like dying stars. The preacher was gone, his Bible floating open beside a barrel. The acrobat's stage had split in two. The fiddler's bow drifted like driftwood past the bridge. By midnight, the river was chaos, chunks of ice colliding with muffled booms, shouts echoing from somewhere far below the fog. The frost fair, that strange and fleeting kingdom of laughter, had dissolved into the same darkness it had defied. When morning came, the banks were littered with fragments. A red ribbon, a shoe, a splintered sign that still read, "Hot ale, 2d." The ice was broken now, cracked in long black veins stretching from shore to shore. The Thames was breathing again, slow and terrible. And though Londoners would speak of the fair for years afterward, of its colours, its joy, its music, they would always lower their voices when they reached its end. For in the heart of the river, under the shifting ice, the fires still flickered faintly that morning. Some swore they heard laughter drifting up from the cracks, not screams, but laughter as if the river itself were remembering the moment when death and celebration became the same sound. After the night the ice gave way, London awoke to a silence, so complete it felt unnatural. The fair was gone, swallowed whole, and the city held its breath as though afraid to make a sound that might wake the river again. Smoke no longer rose from the frozen chimneys. The markets stood empty. Even the bells of street pools remained still, their tongues locked in frost. The world had turned to glass. The first to walk the riverbank that morning found it unrecognizable. Where once there had been color, laughter, and the scent of roasted meat, now there was only wreckage, a strange, frozen ruin stretching beneath a grey sky. Tattered canvas lay stiff against the ice, its poles jutting like ribs from a carcass. A child's shoe, small as a bird's nest, sat half-buried near the bridge. Coins glinted faintly inside cracks, trapped forever. Here and there, frozen pools reflected the faces of those who stared too long, pale, wavering, almost familiar. The city moved like an old man, learning to walk again. Men gathered along the bridges, peering down into the fog. The river looked solid still, but they knew better. It had betrayed them once, and they would not test it again. A constable near Blackfriars marked the edge of the ice with stakes and rope, warning the curious to keep back. No one spoke above a whisper. Even the wind seemed to hold itself, moving slow and careful between the buildings. In the poorer quarters, where fires had gone out days before, the silence was broken only by the sound of hammers. Coffins were being built from whatever wood remained, doors, tables, stair rails. The frost had made the wood brittle, splintering it with every strike. By midday, the streets were lined with black carts. the same ones that had once carried grain and coal. The drivers moved without calling to their horses, their wheels muffled by snow. Each cart left behind a trail of faint indentations, filling quickly with drifting ice. The frost seemed thicker now, as though the river's collapse had released something colder than weather. The air glittered faintly, and breath hung heavy, refusing to fade. Windows bloomed with patterns like feathers, curling inward from the glass. Inside, the living sat close together without speaking, afraid of what words might summon. In taverns, no songs were sung. In churches, prayers went unfinished. The frost had taken their voices too. By evening, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks. The clouds lifted, revealing a pale, hollow blue. It was almost beautiful, the way the sunlight struck the ice, the way the rooftops shone. But no one smiled. The city was too tired to marvel. The Thames reflected the sky perfectly, smooth and untouched, giving London two heavens, one above, one below. Between them hung the silence, heavy and eternal. As night fell, the river began to whisper again, faint, almost kind, as if to reassure the city it still lived. The sound echoed through the arches of the bridges, a slow, deliberate sigh. Those who heard it turned away. They did not want to listen. The river had already spoken once that week, and the price of its voice was too high. In time, the silence became part of London, a second skin over the noise and breath of the living. It crept into the streets, the churches, the taverns, the hearts of men, and though the frost would one day melt, though spring would return, the quiet of that morning would remain a silence so pure it seemed to belong to the dead, a hush that even the bells dared not break. The river had claimed his first canvas. The painting he had made weeks earlier, that quiet portrait of smoke and ice, had been lost when the fair collapsed. Thomas Latch had watched it happen from the embankment, his easel tipped, his brushes scattered, his work vanishing beneath the same frozen water that had once been his muse. Since that night, he had not painted a stroke. He had walked the city like a ghost, his hands still raw from the cold, carrying nothing but the memory of that first stillness. But on the morning after the silence fell, something drew him back. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps duty, or perhaps the artist's stubborn desire to witness the world at its worst. Whatever it was, he found himself again at Westminster Bridge, staring down at the broken ice. The fog had thinned, revealing a river half dead, half-living shards of white drifting slowly on a black current that pulsed beneath. It looked like a mirror smashed by God. Thomas set his easel once more, the wood creaking in protest. The paint inside his box had frozen stiff, but he held it close to the brazier of a nearby watchman until the colors softened. There were fewer people about now, and those who passed did so quietly, their boots leaving tracks that filled with frost as soon as they were gone. London had grown afraid of its own breath. He began to paint, not the fair, not the fires, not the river as spectacle, but the aftermath, the world stripped bare. His brush moved slow, deliberate, almost reverent. He mixed white with grey until it matched the colour of fog, then streaked it across the canvas, building the shape of the bridge. He used black for the gaps in the ice, where the water showed through, dark as a pupil, and in the middle he painted light, not warmth, but something fainter, thinner, the kind of light that lives only in memory. A child stopped to watch him. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her coat, 3 sizes too large, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "Why paint that?" she asked softly, her breath clouding between them. "It's only dead ice." Thomas smiled without looking up. "Because even dead things deserve to be seen." The girl tilted her head. "Will it come back? The river?" he said. "Always." She nodded solemnly and left. Her small figure vanished into the fog like a stroke of paint being wiped away. By dusk, his fingers were stiff and bloodless, but he did not stop. The river darkened beneath him, and the last light turned the broken ice into mirrors of red and gold, the city reflected in ruin. He added one final detail. A tiny figure at the edge of the canvas, standing on the bridge with a brush in hand, facing the wreckage. It was not vanity that made him include himself. It was confession. When he stepped back, he saw it clearly for the first time, not a painting of loss, but of witnessing. The frost had been a thief, yes, but also a teacher. It had stripped London to its bones and shown what remained when the noise and heat were gone. He packed his things slowly, wrapped the canvas in cloth, and began the long walk home. Behind him, the river shifted, cracking softly in the dark. The sound followed him through the streets, echoing between the frozen walls. And though he could not see it, the surface of the Thames began to move again just slightly, just enough to glimmer beneath the moon. The city, like his painting, had begun to breathe once more, fragile and trembling, but alive. By March, the frost had begun to lose its edge, or so London believed. The days lengthened by minutes, the light softened, and a thin mist of meltwater slicked the cobblestones by noon. But each night, the cold crept back, undoing what little warmth dared to return. The city lived in a cruel rhythm now, hope by day, disappointment by dusk. The thaw would begin, shimmer, falter, and freeze again. It was as if the river could not decide whether to die or live. Along the Thames, puddles formed on the ice, where fires had once burned. The water glimmered faintly in the morning light, reflecting the sagging tents and the leaning poles that still dotted the river's corpse. They said the frost fair had been a miracle, but now it was only a ghost. The stalls had collapsed into heaps of timber and canvas, half sunken into slush. Every thaw brought the sound of dripping, a slow, relentless rhythm that filled the air like distant weeping. The poor suffered most, as they always did. The poor ground was too hard to dig graves, but too soft now to bear weight. The burial carts sank into the mud near Holborn, wheels turning uselessly. In the alleys, the frost had begun to turn foul. The air smelled of damp wool and rot. Coal sellers huddled in doorways with their sacks half empty, waiting for prices to fall. It was said that in one parish, a man had melted down his wife's silver combs for the price of 2 days' fire. The river, once motionless, had begun to stir beneath its skin. Cracks opened wider with each tide, and dark water lapped at their edges like a tongue tasting freedom. The ferrymen watched from the banks, their oars stacked neatly beside them, waiting for the day they could work again. But the thaw teased them cruelly, freezing the surface by morning, breaking it by afternoon. One could not trust the river yet. It was neither safe nor dead. Thomas Latch returned daily to paint it. His latest canvas showed the Thames as a battlefield, patches of white, streaks of black, and pale blue reflections of a sun that could not warm. He called it the Waiting River. When asked why he came back each morning to the same ruined view, he only said, "Because it keeps changing, even when it looks still." In Westminster, the upper classes began to whisper of divine judgment. The frost had lasted too long. It was unnatural, unchristian. The newspapers printed sermons disguised as articles. Repentance before the thaw, the river as mirror of sin. In the parlours, the talk was of the world ending slowly, one frozen day at a time. And still the thaw would not come. Each sunrise began with promised droplets hanging from eaves, frost soft enough to crumble underfoot, and each sunset ended in defeat. The cold returned like an old debt, unrelenting, exacting, precise. It crept into cellars, into lungs, into dreams. People stopped predicting when it would end. They simply endured. By late March, the sound of cracking ice echoed through the night. Again, though no one dared call it a good omen, the river's voice was uncertain, groaning, sighing, whispering. In the faint moonlight, the water beneath looked alive, black and restless, but the ice above it refused to give way. London waited, half hoping, half dreading, listening for the moment when the frost would finally break, knowing that when it did, the city would change forever. The thaw was coming, yes, but like all mercies in London, it would come with a cost. The frost had written its own scripture across London, and nowhere was that more evident than in the small print shops that lined Fleet Street. Their presses, once loud as thunder and hot as breath, had fallen to a dull rhythm, slow, uneven, like a heartbeat fading. Ink froze in its pots, type cracked from the cold, and paper curled stiff at the edges. Yet the printers kept working. If the city could not speak, they would give it words. Each morning before dawn, a handful of men and boys gathered in one narrow shop, Frost and Bell, printers to the crown. Though the grandeur of the title had long since faded, they came shivering, their coats dusted white, their boots caked with ice. The great press stood in the center of the room like a black animal waiting to be fed. The apprentices built a small fire beneath the table to keep the gears from seizing, and the air filled with the smell of coal smoke and oil. "Keep the rollers moving, or they'll stiffen again," barked old Mr. Bell, his hands blue to the wrists. He had printed through wars and plagues, but he said this cold was worse than both. His fingers were wrapped in strips of linen. The ink had seeped through, black against the white like veins. Every so often he paused to blow on them, the breath leaving his lips in little ghosts that drifted over the press. The day's work was simple but endless. Sheets for the morning paper, the London Chronicle, now reduced to 2 pages for want of materials. The headlines had lost their triumph, no more tales of empire, no ballads of invention. Now the columns spoke only of the weather, of famine, of names collected from parish death rolls. Frost claims 200 more. Read 1. Bodies found beneath bridge. The printers did not read as they set the type. They could not afford to. In the corner, a young writer named Matthew Crane hunched over a desk, scratching notes by candlelight. His ink was thick with ice, his nib skipping across the paper like a knife over glass. He was writing not a story, but a plea, a sermon in disguise. "The frost will not last forever," he wrote, "but neither will mercy." His words trembled as he wrote them, not from fear but from the cold gnawing at his bones. When he finished, he slipped the page into the press, hiding it between advertisements for gin and coal. By morning, his message would scatter through the city like ash. At midday, the bell over the door rang, and a woman stepped in with a scarf drawn high around her face. She handed Mr. Bell a folded sheet, an obituary for her husband, lost to the river weeks before. He took it without speaking, nodding once. His fingers left black prints on the paper, small smudges like fingerprints of grief. As dusk fell, the fire guttered, and the room dimmed to blue. The last sheets rolled from the press, damp and cold to the touch. The apprentices stacked them carefully, the ink glistening faintly in the dying light. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, heavy and close. Mr. Bell sat back, flexing his stiff hands. His palms were black with ink, but when he turned them toward the candle, the color looked almost red. "The frost doesn't care for words," he muttered, "but we keep printing them anyway." He blew out the flame. The presses stilled. The silence that followed was immense, a hush filled with the faint crack of the ice outside and the rustle of drying paper, the sound of history trying to warm itself on words that could not thaw the world. By the middle of March, the frost had turned London into its own graveyard. There were no processions now, no tolling bells or black horses draped in velvet, only the steady silence of carts moving through the dawn, carrying bodies stiff with ice. They came from every quarter of the city, from alleys in Southwark, from doorsteps in Shoreditch, from attic rooms above the Thames where the frost crept in through the walls like smoke. The city's breath had stopped, and those who still lived moved quietly among the dead, as though afraid to disturb their sleep. Outside street brides, a line of coffins stretched down the street. The wood was rough, hacked from old furniture and broken fences, the nails hammered in crooked by hands too numb to guide them. The gravediggers worked from sunrise until the light failed, their shovels striking the ground like bells. The earth was still half frozen, hard as iron, and each blow sent sparks of pain up through their arms. Some graves were shallow, they had to be, and others were merely trenches filled with bodies wrapped in sheets. There was no room left for ceremony. The priest's voice, hoarse and thin, barely carried over the wind. The rich were not spared, though their deaths came differently. In the great houses of Mayfair, fires burned day and night, and yet the frost still found them creeping under doors, silencing their hearts in sleep. Servants whispered of their masters discovered in their beds, faces serene, hands folded as if in prayer. The papers called it a peaceful passing, but those who washed the bodies said otherwise. The frost had marked them all, leaving their skin pale and translucent, like marble veined with blue. On the river, the ice still floated in jagged sheets, drifting downstream with its grim cargo. Fishermen from Rotherhithe hauled nets not for eels, but for the lost men, women, and children encased in glassy shells, their faces frozen in half-remembered expressions. Some they could identify by the clothes still clinging to them. Others were strangers, nameless, claimed by no one. Those were left near the shore, laid out in rows to await collection by the parish carts. At dusk, the city glowed faintly in the fog, thousands of candles burning in the windows, each one a ward against the darkness. From above, London might have looked alive again, a constellation of flickering stars spread across the earth. But below that fragile light was stillness. The frost had muted every sound, every breath. Only the creak of wood and the crack of ice remained. Among the living, conversation had become a language of endurance. In taverns, men spoke of the cold as if it were an army, invisible, relentless, undefeatable. When spring comes, they said, we'll drink to the dead. But spring did not come, not yet. The frost lingered, jealous of its dominion. The living went on building fires, digging graves, whispering prayers that turned to vapor in the air. Near the steps of street brides, a child placed a single white flower atop one of the coffins. It froze there instantly, its petals encased in a thin sheen of ice. The child watched it glimmer, unblinking, before slipping away into the fog. That night, the river groaned again, long and deep, like a sigh, and for the first time, London listened not with fear but with exhaustion. It was as if the Thames itself had grown weary of keeping the dead, as though it longed for the warmth that would finally carry them away. But the thaw still waited beyond the horizon, slow and cruel, and the city, half buried in frost, did what it had done all winter. It endured in silence, breathing softly between the dead. In a narrow lane off Cheapside, between a shuttered tailor and a pawn shop sealed in frost, stood a small apothecary's shop. Its sign, carved with curling letters now ghosted in white, read Hollis and Son, Remedies and Restoratives, since 1778. But there was no son anymore. There was only Samuel Hollis, a man with ink-black nails, trembling hands, and a conscience worn thin by the cold. Inside, the air was a heavy stew of camphor, vinegar, and spirits of hartshorn. Shelves bowed beneath jars of powders and pickled roots. Some held honest cures, others nothing more than hope. The mortar and pestle on the counter never rested. Hollis ground until his fingers cracked, mixing concoctions he no longer trusted. "A draught for the lungs," he told one woman, pressing a vial into her hand. It was mostly brandy laced with a pinch of mustard seed. "A tonic for the joints," he murmured to an old sailor, though the bottle contained only water boiled with cloves. In the Esprit, frost, truth mattered less than faith, and faith, even in false medicine, was a balm. He worked by candlelight that guttered in the draught, the flame bending sideways, as though trying to escape. The frost crept down the walls like mold, swallowing the color from the room. Each morning, he woke to find his medicines crystallized, syrups turned to glass, poultices hard as stone. Still they came to him, mothers with coughing infants, men clutching their chests, girls pale with hunger. Some came to live, others to die near the smell of herbs rather than the stink of coal smoke. On a Tuesday, a priest from Street Dunstan's arrived, his breath clouding in the air. He carried a list names of those too weak to walk, those trapped in their homes. "You'll make something for them," he said, his voice cracked with fatigue. Anything to give them strength. Hollis looked at the list. 43 names. He nodded, though he had nothing left that could help. He brewed through the night, grinding until the sound of the pestle filled the room like a heartbeat. He mixed camphor with brandy, laudanum with syrup, until his eyes stung and his fingers went numb. He whispered as he worked, not prayers, but apologies. At dawn, the vials stood in a neat row on the counter, each stoppered with wax. The label read simply, "Elixir against the cold." The priest returned with a cart, and together they loaded the bottles into straw baskets. Hollis watched him disappear into the fog, his figure swallowed by the same grey air that filled every corner of the city. He leaned against the counter, exhausted, the smell of camphor thick enough to make him dizzy. By evening, word spread that the draft worked, or seemed to. In the parishes near the river, the coughing softened, and the sick whispered blessings for the apothecary. Hollis smiled for the first time in months, but by morning they were gone, all 43. The priest never returned. When Hollis heard the news, he didn't speak. He only stepped outside and stood in the street, his breath white in the air. Around him, the frost glistened like powdered glass. He closed his shop that night, leaving the door unlatched, the vials still glowing faintly on the shelves. Weeks later, when the thaw finally reached Cheapside, the neighbors found the door open and the apothecary empty. On the counter sat a single bottle, uncorked, its contents frozen mid-swell. A scrap of paper beneath it read, "For the city." No one touched it. They said the frost would never melt where that shop had stood, as if the cold itself had taken root there, not in the earth, but in the memory of mercy turned poison. By April, the frost had outlasted its welcome, and even the wealthy began to feel its teeth. Coal had become as precious as gold, and the merchants who once dealt in fine silks now whispered of smuggling and hoarding. The grand houses of Westminster and Bloomsbury, built for comfort and display, had turned into glittering prisons. The frost climbed the windows, the pipes burst in the walls, and the servants, once invisible, became the only barrier between their masters and the cold. In one such house on Portland Place, Lady Eugenia Mortimer presided over a dining table set for no one. The crystal goblets were cracked from frost, the silver forks gleamed but were never used. Her husband, Lord Mortimer, had taken ill weeks before and now lay upstairs, shivering even beneath the weight of 6 blankets. The servants burned through the furniture to keep his room warm, a different chair each night, until the parlor looked like a ruin. Eugenia had stopped ordering new wood. The deliveries never came. The Thames, the old rumor said, had swallowed them whole. Down in the kitchen, the staff moved in silence. The cook's breath came out in plumes over the blackened stove, where a single pot simmered. There was no meat, only scraps of barley and a thin bone boiled until it gave up its last trace of flavor. "Soup for the master," she muttered, though she knew it would do nothing. Hunger made her dizzy, and she licked the spoon when no one was looking. In the servants' hall, a dozen others huddled near the embers, maids, footmen, the coachman who had nothing left to drive. They spoke in whispers, their voices low and flat. "2 houses down," said one. "They found the butler dead in his pantry, hands full of coal." Another nodded, staring into the ashes. "We'll all be that way soon," he said. No one disagreed. Upstairs, Lady Mortimer wandered through her drawing rooms, the hem of her gown sweeping frost from the floor. The portraits on the toit walls seemed to watch her, their painted eyes bright and accusing. Her reflection in the glass looked spectral, pale hair, hollow cheeks, pearls dulled to grey. The frost had reached even her jewelry box, coating her diamonds in a skin of white. They glittered faintly, like snow caught in lamplight. When the cook brought the soup, Eugenia carried it to her husband herself. He was awake but distant, his breath shallow. "It's all right," she whispered, feeding him a spoonful. "It's warming." But his lips were too cold to answer. She placed her hand on his chest, felt nothing, and sat beside him as the candlelight faltered. Outside, the frost pressed against the window like a curious guest. By morning, Lord Mortimer was gone. The servants found her still, sitting beside him, her fingers frozen to the cup in her hand. She looked peaceful, almost beautiful, her eyes open toward the grey dawn. When word reached the parish, no one was surprised. In the city's counting, the rich and the poor now died alike. Cold is an honest equalizer. The Mortimer house was sealed, its curtains drawn, its gates chained. But at night, those who passed swore they could see the windows flicker faintly, as though fire still burned inside. It was said that when the thaw finally came, the floor of the dining room had split from the cold. Beneath it lay a pile of ashes, not from the hearth, but from the furniture, from silk, from portraits, from everything that once proclaimed wealth. The frost had eaten not only life, but luxury. In the end, hunger had devoured the very idea of comfort, leaving behind only emptiness and the faint, hollow echo of spoons against porcelain. By the time April dwindled into its grey, reluctant spring, London had learned not to trust sunlight. The frost still clung to the gutters and to the edges of rooftops, retreating by day only to creep back at night. The city had grown thinner, quieter, its people moving through the streets like shadows, wary of every promise of warmth. But on Fleet Street, where the bakers had reopened their ovens, the first smell of fresh bread drifted through the air like a hymn. It was there, beneath a bakery window glazed with steam, that a small girl stood each morning. Her name was Clara Bell. She was 9 years old, though she looked younger, her face pale and narrow, her hands red and cracked. Each dawn, she arrived before the shutters were raised and waited for the scent to rise, that soft, impossible smell of yeast and butter. She would press her palms against the window, leaving 2 faint ovals in the frost, and stare at the loaves cooling on the rack inside. The baker, Mr. Enderby, had noticed her weeks before. At first, he had chased her away. "No loitering," he'd barked, though his voice lacked conviction. But she kept returning, silent as breath. When he opened each morning, she would be there, watching. He'd grown used to it, almost comforted by it. On days when she did not appear, he found himself looking through the window for her reflection. One afternoon, when the sun broke through the clouds, he stepped outside with a small roll in his hand. "Here," he said gruffly, "take it before it freezes." Clara looked up, eyes wide but unreadable. She accepted it slowly, as if the bread were sacred. Then, instead of eating it, she broke it in half and ran across the street to a boy sitting by a lamppost, shivering under a thin coat. Together, they ate in silence, heads bowed like worshippers. The next day, Mr. Enderby left a second roll on the windowsill before opening his shop. He did the same the day after, and the day after that. Soon the routine became wordless. The bread would appear, and the girl would come. She never spoke to him, but sometimes she smiled, a small, flickering thing, quick as light on glass. Then came a night of bitter wind, colder than any in weeks. Snow fell again, heavy and wet, smothering the cobbles in silence. The next morning, when Enderby came to lift the shutters, the bread was still there on the sill untouched. He frowned and looked up and down the street, expecting to see her waiting in her usual place. But the corner was empty. He waited until the noon bell rang, then again until dusk. The roll turned hard, its crust pale with frost. On the third day, a constable found her in a doorway near the print shop. The boy curled beside her. They were holding hands, her fingers still clutching a fragment of bread. Enderby closed the bakery early that day. He kept the shutters drawn for a week. When he finally reopened, he placed a small loaf in the window round, golden and uncut. Beneath it, he set a placard written in his own shaky hand, "For the children of the frost." He never sold that loaf. As spring crept through the city, and the thaw at last began to break the river's skin, it remained there on the sill, gathering dust instead of snow. And on certain mornings, when the first light touched the window pane just right, he swore he could still see 2 faint handprints there, small, perfectly shaped, pressed into the glass as though the frost itself remembered her. When the frost first began to loosen its grip on the city, the royal gardens were still locked beneath white silence. The fountains stood stiff and ghostly. The hedges glistened like silver filigree under the weak sun. Inside St. James's Palace, fires burned in every hearth, but even the smoke rose slowly, as if tired. Courtiers in heavy coats shuffled along the corridors, whispering of providence and punishment. For the first time in living memory, frost had touched the crown itself. King George, old now and half-blind, sat in his chamber staring at a single candle. The flame wavered but refused to go out, its small persistence the only movement in the room. The frost had crept across the window beside him, patterning the glass with veins that looked almost like roots, as if winter itself were trying to grow inward. Servants moved quietly behind him, changing the basin water before it froze, and stirring the fire that gave no warmth. The physicians had begged him to stay in bed, but he would not. "If London stands, I shall stand with it," he'd said, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. Outside, the palace courtyard had been turned into a strange spectacle. The poor gathered there each day, drawn by the rumors that the king had ordered bread and coal to be distributed. They came wrapped in rags, their faces red and raw from the wind, bowing when the guards appeared with baskets. The soldiers handed out loaves still steaming from the royal ovens, the smell of yeast mingling with the faint sweetness of burning pine. It was a rare mercy, but even mercy froze quickly that season. The bread hardened before it reached the back of the crowd, and the poorest often received nothing but crumbs. In the palace chapel, prayers were held daily for deliverance. The choir's voices trembled as they sang, their breath rising like incense. The Queen herself attended each service, her jewels hidden beneath a plain shawl, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles shone white. "God humbles all," she murmured once to her ladies. "Even kings must learn the cold." Her words, like the frost, lingered in the air long after she spoke them. Messengers came and went, bringing reports from across the city. Churches filled with the starving, streets clogged with carts of the dead, merchants ruined, factories silenced. Yet what troubled the palace most was the quiet. London had always been a creature of noise, of markets and carriages, laughter and quarrels, but now it lay still, a vast animal holding its breath. The frost had muffled even the heartbeat of empire. One evening, as dusk bled through the fog, the king ordered the curtains drawn back. "I will see it," he said. The servants obeyed, revealing the city spread before him, a sea of rooftops glowing faintly under ice. He gazed for a long time without speaking. Then, in a voice worn and thin, he said, "She looks crowned." No one dared answer. The frost had indeed laid its crown upon London, a glittering, merciless diadem of white. It sparkled in the dying light, beautiful and terrible. And though the king's candle burned on into the night, its glow was pale beside the cold majesty outside. The next morning, the frost began to thaw in the gardens. The first drop of meltwater fell from a branch onto the royal steps, a single bead of glass against stone. It was small, almost invisible, yet it marked the beginning of the end, the slow surrender of winter's reign. But for those who had lived through it, the sight brought no joy. The frost might leave the crown, yes, but its touch had already become a memory carved too deep to melt. The thaw, when it finally came, was not gentle. It did not whisper its way through London like a promise kept. It arrived like judgment. The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. The ice on the Thames, which had held for nearly 10 weeks, began to darken from beneath. It cracked not in one place, but everywhere at once, a chorus of splintering, a deep roar that rolled through the bridges and echoed down every alley near the water. The river had remembered itself. At first, people thought it was a good omen. They gathered along the banks to watch the ice shift, pointing to the widening seams that shimmered under the weak sun. "Spring's come at last," said a fishmonger near Southwark, grinning through chapped lips. "Gods let the water breathe again." But by afternoon, that same man was running for his life as the ice began to break apart. Great plates the size of tavern roofs heaved and tilted, crashing into one another with sounds like cannon fire. The frost fare's remains, stalls, signs, barrels, and the bones of tents were wrenched free and pulled under. At Blackfriars Bridge, a section of the old ice tore loose and swept downstream, carrying with it fragments of wood and a handful of unlucky souls who'd ventured too far. Spectators screamed as the surface buckled, throwing men and horses into the black water below. The river did not discriminate. It took the poor who scavenged, the curious who lingered, even the city guards sent to warn them away. Within minutes, the Thames was a battlefield of ice and current, swirling with wreckage and debris. By nightfall, the floodwaters began to rise. The thaw released everything the frost had trapped, the melted snow from the hills, the clogged drains, the rot of months. The Thames swelled with a groaning fury, climbing its banks, turning the lower streets into slow-moving canals. Barrels, crates, and the remnants of the fare floated through the lanes, knocking against doors and windows. The lamps along the embankment flickered out, drowned in the tide. At Street, Paul's Wharf, Thomas Latch, the painter, stood once more with his easel, though he painted nothing. He watched the river reclaim the world he had been trying to capture, the fare, the laughter, even the silence, all swallowed by the same dark current. He felt the bridge tremble beneath his feet as a huge mass of ice struck one of its piers, the sound echoing through the fog like the toll of a bell. "It's taking it all back," he murmured, and he was right. By midnight, the river had become a moving grave. Bodies rose where the ice broke, pale faces turning briefly toward the sky before vanishing. The poor on the south bank built makeshift rafts from doors and barrels to flee the rising water, while those in the upper city watched from their windows, helpless. The frost, which had once seemed eternal, now dissolved with vengeful haste, as though eager to erase its own memory. When dawn came, London was unrecognizable. The great river that had once slept beneath a sheet of glass now ran wild and swollen, its surface cluttered with the ruins of the frost fair. Shards of ice glittered like broken mirrors, reflecting the pale, indifferent sun. The city stood shivering on its edges, drenched but breathing, watching as the water carried its dead and its history out toward the sea. They called it the breaking of the Thames, and in the years that followed, people spoke of it as though it were the river's revenge, not for the fires lit upon its back or the laughter that mocked its stillness, but for the arrogance of a city that had thought it could tame even the cold. The frost had bound London. Now the river unbound it. And in that violent thaw, the city learned the truth of its own survival, that life returns not softly, but with the force of destruction, washing clean everything that dared to stand still. The night after the river broke was one London would not soon forget. It began with a sigh, a deep, groaning exhale from beneath the ice that still clung to the banks. The Thames, long silenced under its frozen shroud, was breathing again. But its breath came too quickly, too fiercely, as if it were trying to make up for all the months it had been denied. The thawing ice cracked and shattered with each tide, and from beneath rose the flood. The water came up through the drains, first sluggish and brown, smelling of mud and iron. It spread across the cobblestones of the lower wards, pooling between the steps of alahouses and markets. The people there barely noticed at first. They had survived the frost. What was a little water to fear? But by midnight, it was no longer puddles they waded through, but rivers cold, dark, and fast. The tide had turned inward, reclaiming the streets with the strength of something long betrayed. At Queenhithe, the water burst through a warehouse wall, toppling barrels and crates like toys. Coal floated where it had once been stacked in neat black pyramids. Men scrambled onto rooftops with lanterns, shouting warnings that disappeared into the wind. The current was thick with debris ice, splintered wood, and the twisted remains of the frost fare's forgotten stalls. Somewhere, a church bell rang once, then went silent. The sound of the river drowned everything. By dawn, the flood had reached Ludgate Hill. The lower houses stood knee-deep in icy water, their windows glowing faintly with the light of candles lit in panic. Families dragged trunks onto upper floors, whispering prayers between coughs. Children stared through windows as boats drifted past, not the sleek barges of summer, but makeshift crafts built from doors and barrels, steered by men with sticks instead of oars. Some laughed at the absurdity of it, even as they wept. The bridges groaned beneath the strain. Ice chunks slammed against their pillars, leaving gouges in the stone. From Blackfriars to London Bridge, crowds gathered to watch the river roar beneath them. The sound was like thunder drawn out over hours, endless, resonant, alive. One old woman, her face hidden under a shawl, whispered, "It's the dead. The river's spitting them back." No one corrected her. They had seen the pale shapes drifting in the current, faces upturned, spinning slowly in the eddies before disappearing under the next surge of black water. In Westminster, the flood reached the steps of Parliament. The guards formed lines with sandbags, though they knew it was useless. The water lapped higher, murmuring against the stone, as if in mockery of their efforts. Ministers stood at the windows, staring down at the rising tide. "The river's reclaiming her debt," one said quietly, his voice trembling. By evening, the flood had begun to recede. The water drew back toward the sea, leaving behind a city that looked both drowned and reborn. Mud coated the sea, streets like a second skin. The air smelled of rot and thaw, of iron and life. The river had retreated, but its mark remained, the line of damp climbing every wall, a reminder of how close death had come, and how swiftly it could return. As night fell, Londoners ventured out with lanterns, their reflections shimmering in the pools that filled every hollow. The ice still floated in pieces, drifting past like fragments of memory. Children threw stones at them, laughing weakly, and watched the ripples spread. The city had survived again, though no one dared call it victory, for beneath the calm surface of the Thames, where the current still swirled and whispered, something ancient seemed to sigh, a sound like both mourning and relief. The flood had not destroyed London, it had baptized it, and in that cold, restless water, the city saw itself anew, fragile, stubborn, unbroken. But the river would not forget. It never did. It began quietly, with a single drip, one hesitant bead of water falling from the eaves of street pools, striking stone with the softest note, then another, and another, until the city seemed to be weeping from every ledge and lintel. The frost that had gripped London for 2 long months was loosening at last. The air smelled different, damp, metallic, and alive, the scent of thawing earth and long-buried decay. By sunrise, the rooftops glistened under a thin sheen of meltwater, and the gutters gurgled like waking throats. At first, people stepped outside in disbelief. The streets were slick with slush, the river grey and restless beneath a skin of melting ice. For weeks they had dreamed of warmth, and yet when it came, it felt foreign, almost cruel. The snow no longer shone white, but collapsed into filth. The city's beauty had melted into mud. A baker on Fleet Street leaned against his doorway, watching his sign drip steadily onto the pavement. "We prayed for this," he muttered, "and look what we got." The thaw revealed everything the frost had hidden. Rats poured from drains, their fur slick and gleaming, carrying the stink of the dead. In the churchyards, shallow graves sank and split, their contents seeping into the soil. The Thames ran high and dark, choked with debris barrels, timbers, bits of cloth, and the pale faces of those it had claimed. Each tide carried the evidence of the season's cruelty, farther out to sea. For all its horror, there was life in the thaw too. Grass showed in thin, trembling blades between the cracks of the cobblestones. Birds returned, gaunt and uncertain, pecking at the thawed refuse along the banks. And in the morning fog, the city's breath came quicker, the rhythm of its heart returning. Vendors began to shout again. Taverns reopened their doors. The first barrels of ale, long frozen, now poured freely, foaming with the heat of the hearths within. Thomas Latch, the painter, stood once more on Westminster Bridge, his hands trembling not from cold but from awe. The The Thames below him was no longer still. It moved with the confidence of something that had reclaimed its power. The ice drifted in chunks toward the sea, glittering faintly like shattered glass. He began sketching again, not the silence this time, but the motion, the resurrection. On his page, the river seemed to breathe. Yet the thaw was not gentle to those already broken. Houses along the lower wards flooded again as the frozen drains burst open. The poor, who had survived the frost by burning everything they owned, now had nothing left to keep out the damp. The frost had killed quietly. The thaw killed slowly. Fevers spread through the alleys, and coughs echoed like echoes of winter. The doctors called it the after-chill. They said it was not the cold that took people now, but the body's memory of it. By late April, the last sheet of ice slipped beneath the Blackfriars arches. The river rolled on, indifferent, carrying the wreckage of tents, toys, and timber relics of a carnival turned requiem. The frost was gone, yet its silence lingered in the corners of London, in the hearts of those who had watched loved ones disappear into the cold. That night, a soft rain fell, the first true rain in months. It washed the soot from the windows, turned the alleys to rivers again, and filled the air with the smell of earth. The people of London did not curse it. They stood at their doorways and let it touch their faces, feeling for the first time not pain, but something like forgiveness. The great thaw had come, not kind, not clean, but real. It carried away the frost, the corpses, the lies of endurance, and left behind a city raw and alive. The river roared beneath the bridges once more, and though its voice was rough with grief, it was unmistakably human. The sound of breath returned to a city that had forgotten how to breathe. When the frost finally released its hold, London did not awaken all at once. It stirred, groaned, and blinked, as though recovering from a fever. The streets that had once glistened white were now a mire of filth and melted dreams. The snow had hidden everything, the bodies, the waste, the broken things people had burned to stay alive. Now, the thaw laid it all bare. Piles of refuse steamed in the early light. Water seeped into the foundations of houses, rotting wood that had survived the winter's bite. The air stank of ash, smoke, and decay. The perfume of endurance turned sour. The river was the worst of it. The Thames, unbound at last, was swollen and black. Its surface carried the detritus of months, the splintered bones of boats, the remains of the frost fair's tents, fragments of furniture, and the pale, floating faces of those the city had lost. Bargemen pushed off the banks with poles, shouting to one another as they guided their crafts between the drifting wreckage. Some pulled bodies from the current. Most did not. The flood had left too many. The tide would carry them out to sea soon enough. For weeks, the city reeked of rot. The first warm winds turned the alleys into traps of sickness. Fever spread where frost had fallen. Doctors called it the thaw fever, though none could name its cause. They bled their patients, prescribed vinegar and prayer, and watched them fade just as the ice had. The graveyards overflowed once more, the soil too soft to hold the weight of death. And yet, among the ruin, life resumed with startling stubbornness. Markets reopened, though their goods were meager. Fishermen returned to the docks, tossing their nets into the turbulent water. Blacksmiths relit their forges, the ring of hammers echoing through streets still streaked with mud. Even laughter returned, though it was a brittle sound, the kind that cracked easily. The frost had not destroyed London. It had only carved it thin. What remained was a city pared, down to its bone. One evening, near Southwark, a small crowd gathered by the water's edge. A barge had drifted ashore, caught on a broken mooring. Inside were the remnants of the frost fair, a banner half burned, a cracked mug, a child's mitten stiff with ice. The onlookers watched in silence as a man lifted the banner and spread it open. The words were faded but legible. A merry winter upon the Thames. Someone laughed, a single, harsh sound that ended in a cough. Then the crowd dispersed, leaving the banner fluttering weakly in the damp wind. Thomas Latch passed by later, sketchbook in hand. He drew the scene quickly, the bent banner, the empty barge, the rippling water that had no reflection. When he finished, he closed his book and stood listening. Somewhere, upriver, the bells began to ring again. They were hesitant at first, rusty from months of silence, but then they found their rhythm. The sound rolled through the streets, over the roofs, and across the bridges, reaching even the poorest quarters. For the first time in months, Londoners lifted their heads. The sound did not erase the pain, but it reminded them that the world still turned, that time still moved forward. The frost had taken thousands, but it had not stopped the clocks. As night fell, the river gleamed faintly beneath the moon, no longer a sheet of death but a moving mirror. The wind carried the scent of rain, not smoke, and in that fragile peace, dirty, imperfect, alive, the city began, slowly, to remember itself. The frost had passed, but the memory of it lingered in every face, every sound, every breath drawn in the damp air. The great winter of 1814 would never be forgotten. It had buried London once, and in thawing, it had taught her how to rise again. By the time May arrived, the frost had become history, but its ghosts were everywhere. The churches filled not with worshippers, but with names, lists written in every kind of hand, elegant cursive, crooked scrawl, smudged ink covered the walls and pews, curling at the corners from damp. Parish clerks sat hunched at tables beneath the dim light of dripping candles, transcribing from scraps of paper carried in by the living. They called it the Ledger of the Lost, though no ledger could ever hold them all. At street brides, where the frost had buried dozens beneath the same patch of earth, the rector worked from dawn until dark, ink staining his cuffs, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Beside him, the clerk recited names gathered from the streets: Elizabeth Turner, washerwoman, aged 32, Samuel Hargreaves, chimney sweep, 12, infant unnamed, found by the river wall. Each was written carefully, as if precision could restore breath. When the list grew too long for the page, they began again. Mothers came clutching shawls that still held the scent of their children. Widows brought lockets, coins, or scraps of fabric, hoping a match might be found. The churchyard had become a place of gathering, not of faith, but of accounting. They wanted proof that those they had loved had existed, that the frost had not erased them completely. Some found solace when their names were read aloud. Others left when they did not hear them, their grief sharpening into silence. The government promised a registry, an official count. It never came. There were too many, scattered across too many parishes, buried in haste or swept away by the thaw. Even the river kept its own secrets. Bargemen told of bodies rising days after the flood, faces unrecognizable, clothes long since torn away. They pushed them back into the current. The sea will remember them, one said grimly, if no one else does. In Fleet Street, the printers took up the task instead. They began to publish what they called the names of the frost, small booklets sold for a penny apiece. Each issue listed those confirmed dead, those missing, and those newly found. The profits went to the poorhouses, or so the masthead claimed. Readers lingered over each page, tracing letters with their fingertips. Some wept quietly, others read with morbid fascination, as though tallying the frost's victories like war news. Among the names, Thomas Latch saw one that stopped his breath. Margaret Latch, wife of Thomas, presumed perished. He stood in the print shop doorway, unable to move. She had been gone since January, taken one morning by fever. He had buried her himself, yet to see her name printed, inked and permanent, made it real in a way the cold earth had not. He bought a copy, folded it neatly, and slipped it inside his coat. That night, he burned it. In Westminster, the bells tolled for a full hour in memory of the unnamed. The sound rolled over the city, mingling with the scent of thaw and rot. People stopped in the streets to listen. When the ringing ended, The silence that followed was immense. London had survived, but its soul was thinner, worn. Later that summer, a plaque was hung at the river's edge. It bore no names, only an inscription, for those the frost took and those the river kept. Visitors still came to touch it, though the letters soon dulled from rain. Children traced the grooves with their fingers, asking whose names had once been there. Their parents could not answer. The frost had passed, but its ledger never closed. The names faded, the paper rotted, but the memory remained carried in whispers, in prayer, in the shiver that ran through every Londoner when winter's first wind returned. By June, London had thawed completely, but the air still carried ghosts. Spring came late that year, soft, uncertain, smelling not of flowers but of wet stone and soot. The city's breath was damp and heavy, the kind that lingered in doorways and clung to skin. The frost had gone, yet its absence was not clean. It had left behind a smell no one could forget, of earth disturbed, of wood burned, of the past rotting quietly beneath the bloom. The first green came timidly. Shoots of grass broke through the black soil of the churchyards, forcing their way between the cracks in the paving stones. The trees along the Thames tried to remember their colour. Their buds opened unevenly, half alive, half dead, as if the cold had left its mark deep in the wood. The birds returned too, thin and cautious, their songs carrying faintly through the smoky air. People paused when they heard them, startled by the sound of life. The river, swollen and restless, still bore the evidence of its fury. Each morning the tide washed up strange relics along the banks, bits of timber, broken pottery, a child's shoe, a silver spoon blackened by smoke. Bargemen hauled their nets full of silt and fragments, muttering about what else the Thames might keep buried beneath its surface. But when the sun struck the water just right, it glimmered with a deceptive calm. Children played along the edges again, tossing pebbles, their laughter mingling with the creak of masts and the calls of the gulls. The smell of spring mingled with the odour of decay. As the ground softened, the graves in street brides and street olaves began to sink. The parish men shovelled earth and lime over the disturbed soil, cursing as they worked. They said the frost had preserved the dead too well, and now the warmth had come to finish what winter had only begun. From the riverbank to the alleyways, London reeked of rebirth and rot, a perfume both sweet and sickly. In the taverns, men raised their mugs to the living. The gin was warmer now, the laughter freer, though every joke had a shadow. The memory of the frost lingered like a scar that no one wanted to touch. Even joy felt fragile, a thing to be handled carefully, like glass. A man could still look at the sky and wonder if it might freeze again. Thomas Latch painted through it all. He took his easel to the edge of the thawed river, where the mud glistened and the willows bent low. His new work was not of ice or ruin, but of light, hesitant, pale, breaking through clouds. He called it Resurrection of the Thames. When it was finished, the colours looked almost warm. Almost. On the day he carried it to the gallery, a soft wind swept through the streets, stirring the smell of spring into something gentler, rain, moss, and faint smoke from a chimney that burned wood too new to catch easily. Women hung linens from their windows. Children chased each other through puddles. It was not beauty, not yet, but it was motion. As the pox eyes, evening fell. The bells rang again across the city, not morning, but something quieter, steadier, a reminder that the world had turned once more. From the bridges, one could see the Thames gleaming beneath the dying light, its surface rippling like breath. The frost was gone, the dead were buried, and London, though weary, began to smell of life again, damp, dirty, and unashamed. The city would never forget what it had endured, but in that moment, as the first true spring wind carried the mingled scents of blossom and ash, it began tentatively, achingly to forgive. By midsummer, the frost had faded into rumour. The newspapers had moved on to talk of ships and politics, of trade routes and theatre openings, as though the city had not nearly starved and frozen only months before. But Thomas Latch could not move on. He had painted through every stage of the frost, from its glittering stillness to its violent thaw, and now, even as the air grew warm and forgiving, he found himself unable to stop seeing it. The ice still lived behind his eyelids. He had taken a small studio near the river, its window facing the same water that had haunted him all winter. The light there was kind but pale, filtered through fog even in summer. He spent his days among canvases stacked like gravestones, each one a fragment of that endless season. He had painted the frost fair as a cathedral of light, the collapse as an inferno, the thaw as a funeral. But there was one scene he had never managed to finish, one he had carried in his mind since the morning the river broke. He called it the silence after. Each morning he returned to it, brush trembling in his hand. The canvas showed the river not as it was, but as it had felt endless, flat, white, dissolving into fog. At its center stood a single figure, small and solitary, facing the horizon. Whether it was man, woman, or ghost, he did not know. The light behind them was neither dawn nor dusk. It was something colder, the light of memory, of something once beautiful that had burned away. The room smelled of turpentine and damp wood. The summer heat made him sweat, but he still painted in gloves. His fingers had never fully recovered from the cold. Sometimes the brush slipped, and he would curse softly, his voice the only sound in the quiet room. Outside, the river whispered as it moved, a sound that had once terrified him but now felt like company. One afternoon, a knock came at the door. It was the baker's daughter, a young woman who brought him bread and tea every few days. She stepped inside, blinking at the gloom. "You've painted winter again," she said, glancing at the canvas. "Haven't you had enough of it?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Winter's had enough of me, I think. I'm just trying to see who won." She didn't understand, but she stayed while he worked, her presence a quiet tether to the world outside. The hours passed. The light shifted. When she left, she paused at the door. "It's warm now," she said softly. "You should open the window." He did, after she was gone. The air that entered was thick with the scent of the river mud, salt, and something faintly floral. It felt alive. He sat back and looked at his canvas, at the lone figure standing in the endless white. He dipped his brush in grey, then in the palest yellow, and with one long, careful stroke, drew the faintest glimmer of light, breaking through the fog. Not enough to banish it, only enough to suggest that it could. When the painting was finished, he did not sign it. He simply leaned it against the wall and left the studio door open so that the wind could dry the paint. That evening, as the sun set over the river, the water outside glowed with the same dim, forgiving light he had captured on the canvas, neither cold nor warm, but something between. Days later, when the landlord came to collect his rent, he found the room empty. Only the painting remained, propped against the window. In it, the figure stood upon a half-frozen river that no longer existed, facing a horizon where the frost had finally broken. The colors were quiet, muted, yet in the center of the canvas, faint but undeniable, a soft warmth lingered, as though the painter had managed, at last, to melt the ice. By late summer, when the river had returned to its slow, brown rhythm, the thaw reached places that sunlight had not yet dared to touch: the graveyards. The earth, long locked in ice, softened under the weight of rain. The stones tilted in the mud, the inscriptions ran with moss, and the frost's buried work began to surface. The city had buried its dead in haste, piling them into shallow trenches when the ground had been too hard to dig deep. Now the thaw loosened everything, stirring the quiet into motion. At street brides, the sexton found the first of them. He had gone out early, before dawn, to clear branches fallen in the night storm. The soil squelched under his boots, and when he knelt to pull a tangle of roots from the churchyard wall, the earth shifted. A pale shape pressed upward, soft as wax. He froze, breath caught in his throat, then fetched a lantern. What the light revealed was not horror so much as weary inevitability, the frost's forgotten victims, drawn upward by the heat they had long been denied. The thaw had brought them home. By noon, the churchyard had become a sea of mud and white cloth. The rector ordered quick reburials, but there was little room left. The dead did not rest neatly. The frost had broken their beds. Men with shovels and ropes worked silently, their faces grey. They spoke of the frost as if it were still alive, a trickster god that would not let go. The women who came to pray at the graves stood at a distance, their skirts hemmed with filth, their eyes lowered. The air was thick with the mingled scents of lime, damp wood, and something darker, the smell of life returning too late. Other parishes fared no better. At Street, Olaves in Southwark, the vaults beneath the church flooded when the river rose, the coffins swelling like boats against the ceiling. The verger described the sound they made as sighing, a low, wet creak that seemed almost human. In Wapping, a crypt collapsed entirely, spilling its contents into the street. The children who found it first thought it a curiosity and laughed until their mothers dragged them away screaming. The newspapers, ever hungry for spectacle, called it the rising of the frost dead. The phrase spread quickly, half myth, half truth. Some claimed to see figures walking the graveyards at dusk, not ghosts, but the thawed dead, seeking warmth. Others swore the smell of spring itself was there, doing the last breath of those who had lain too long in the cold. The city, still superstitious from its suffering, crossed itself and moved on. Thomas Latch came to Street Brides one grey afternoon, sketchbook in hand. He drew the half-sunken stones, the water pooling in the hollows, the priest wading through the muck to bless what could not be saved. His pencil caught the tilt of a child's headstone, its name washed away, and beside it, the faint imprint of a small hand pressed into the softened earth. He did not draw the bodies. He drew the bough, flowers instead, wild white blossoms pushing up through the disturbed soil. By September, the graveyards had settled again. The ground dried, the grass grew over, and the city pretended it had seen nothing. But when the wind turned from the north that autumn, carrying the first hint of another winter, the smell returned faint, sour, unmistakable. Those who lived near the churchyards swore they could hear the soil shifting at night, as if the earth itself remembered. The frost had passed, but the thaw had left its mark. It had blurred the boundary between what lived and what did not, between what was buried and what could never stay buried. In the soft mud of London's graveyards, beneath the leaning stones and the whisper of weeds, the dead rested uneasily too close to the surface, too easily found, as if waiting for the cold to return. By October, the air had changed. The city's breath, once sharp and white, came now as mist, softer, slower, almost human again. The streets that had echoed with the crunch of frost were slick with rain instead. Carriages splashed through puddles, and the sound was comforting in its imperfection. The frost had made every noise brittle. Now the world had texture again. London was breathing, quietly, but unmistakably, as if waking from a long, troubled dream. The markets returned first. Beneath tarpaulin awnings along Cheapside and Smithfield, vendors shouted their wares with voices that still cracked from disuse. The air smelled of damp straw, salt fish, apples bruised but fragrant. Peddlers lit small lamps to keep the early dark at bay, their flames trembling in the wind. Customers came wrapped in coats, their pockets lighter but their spirits restless. After months of stillness, even the hum of barter sounded like music. On Fleet Street, the presses thundered again, their iron bellies swallowing reams of paper. The headlines no longer carried death counts. They spoke now of rebuilding, of faith renewed, of the coming year's harvest. It was all optimism for show, of course. The frost had bankrupted many of the city's merchants and driven thousands into debt. The poorhouses were still full, and the scent of sickness clung to the riverbanks, yet hope, fragile and stubborn, had taken root like ivy in the cracks of every wall. Along the Thames, the water moved thick and brown, carrying with it the city's reflection, broken, wavering, but alive. The bargemen had returned to their trade, guiding their loads through the sluggish current. Children stood on the bridges and threw scraps to the gulls, laughing when the birds swooped low. No one spoke of the bodies that had once floated there, or the ice that had sealed the world silent. The river was alive again, and for London, that was enough. The churches began to ring their bells more boldly now. Each Sunday, the sound swept across the rooftops, gathering the living in small, trembling congregations. The priest spoke of mercy, though even they could not quite explain the frost, whether it had been punishment or test. In the pews, people sat shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed not in fear but in gratitude. The air inside was thick with candle smoke and the faint sweetness of thawed wax. Thomas Latch stood at the back of Street Dunstan's one morning, sketchbook closed, hat in hand. He hadn't come to pray. He had come to listen to the sound of breathing, of life returning. The notes of the organ drifted through the nave like the wind off the river, soft and full. For the first time since the frost began, he felt his chest loosen. He thought of his final painting, The Silence After, and realized that this was what it had been missing. Not light, not color, but sound, the low rhythmic pulse of existence continuing. Outside, London stirred. The taverns filled once more with the murmur of conversation, the slow scrape of mugs on wood, the shuffle of boots on stone. The smell of coal returned to the air, harsh but reassuring. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a street singer began a song about spring. The city was not healed, not yet, perhaps not ever, but it had begun to breathe again. Its breath rose in clouds of steam from laundries, in the smoke from chimneys, in the laughter that spilled from doorways. The frost had taken much, but not everything. London still had its lungs, its pulse, its voice, and as dusk settled over the damp streets, the city exhaled long, low, alive, and the river answered, murmuring back, as if they had both survived something sacred. By winter's turn, when the first frost of the new season kissed the rooftops again, London had already begun to forget. Memory, like the river, moved on murky and restless, swallowing what it could not bear to keep. The frost of 1814 was already becoming story, then warning, then myth. The rich called it the Great Winter, their parlours warmed by coal and talk of Providence. The poor called it nothing at all. They were too busy surviving the one that followed. The frost had broken their backs, and the thaw had drowned their hope. When the city thawed, the wealth that returned did not trickle down the alleys or the wharves. It stayed in the squares, in the banks, in the houses that had burned furniture for warmth, and now replaced it with mahogany imported from ships that no longer feared ice. The upper wards repaired their windows and cleaned their chimneys. The lower wards buried their dead and went hungry in silence. The parish relief funds, swollen during the parish, worst of the frost, had dried up as quickly as the river ice. The committees disbanded. The pamphlets that once pleaded for mercy now printed poems and jokes about the frost fair, selling nostalgia to those who had watched the spectacle from their balconies. A merry winter upon the Thames. They laughed, as if laughter had not frozen in the throats of those who died beneath those same bridges. In Suffolk, the poorhouses overflowed again. The walls sweated with damp. The floorboards rotted from the floodwater that had never fully drained. Children coughed themselves awake at night, the air heavy with mildew and regret. The wardens kept lists, names written, then crossed out, then written again as fevers claimed them. No one printed those names. They were not worth the ink. Clara Bell's bakery window, once watched by a starving child, was cleaned and repainted that autumn. The baker himself had grown stout again, his hands red with heat from the new ovens. On the windowsill where he had once placed bread for the hungry, there now stood a painted sign that read, "Frost Fair, biscuits, 2d each." He sold them wrapped in ribbons, shaped like tiny skaters and tents. The customers smiled, remembering how the river had once frozen so beautifully. He never spoke of the child who had died in the doorway. Perhaps he truly did not remember. Thomas Latch's paintings hung briefly in a small gallery near Covent Garden. Critics called them melancholic curiosities, too bleak, too plain, too quiet. The public wanted color now, romance, life without reminder. His masterpiece, The Silence After, sold for less than the price of a fine coat. The buyer hung it in a hallway, where it faded slowly in the smoke. In the taverns, men told the story of the frost with exaggeration and ale. You could roast an ox upon the Thames, they boasted. A whole city danced upon the ice. They never spoke of the smell when it melted, or the spined bodies it kept. The frost became a parlor anecdote, something to marvel at, not mourn. And yet, beneath the cobblestones, beneath the laughter and the ringing of the church bells, the city still remembered in its bones. Every time the wind turned north, people closed their shutters a little tighter. Every winter, when the first sheet of ice formed on the water troughs, the poor drew closer to their fires if they had them and said nothing. The frost had left no monuments, no songs, no saints, only silence. It had burned itself into London's soul in the way only tragedy can quietly, invisibly, and forever. And though the city might pretend otherwise, the poor who had frozen that winter were not gone. They were in the smoke, in the fog, in the river's sigh. Forgotten by name, remembered by chill. The frost had ended, but its shadow remained a cold that outlived memory. Hidden in every winter breath London took thereafter. When the next winter came, the Thames did not freeze. The frost tried, curling along the river's edge and feathering the mooring ropes with delicate lace. But the current would not be bound again. It flowed steady and brown through the heart of the city, restless and unrepentant. Barges moved across its surface once more. Ferries rang their bells in the fog, and the people of London walked the bridges without fear. Yet when the wind blew from the north and the air turned sharp, a hush would fall as if the river itself had drawn a long breath in memory. On certain mornings, when the mist hung low, old men on the embankments swore they could hear it, a deep, muffled creak beneath the surface, like ice shifting in its sleep. The water never stilled long enough to show a reflection, but sometimes, just before dawn, the light on it took on a strange hue, faintly white, faintly gold, as though the frost still glimmered below. The younger folk laughed at such tales, calling them the inventions of age, but the elders knew better. The river had a memory, and it was older than theirs. The frost fair had become a story told by firelight. Grandchildren sat at their grandparents' knees and listened with wide eyes as they heard of oxen roasted on the Thames, of tents and music, of painted signs that declared a fair upon the river itself. They did not hear of the screams when the ice cracked, nor of the bodies the flood carried away. Time had polished the horror into legend, the way the tide polishes glass, smooth, glittering, harmless to the touch. But the river knew the truth beneath the telling. At Street, Paul's Wharf, where Thomas Latch had once stood with his easel, a small boy found a fragment of wood washed ashore, the corner of a painted board. The letters were faded, but he could make out part of a word, mare. He brought it to his mother, who smiled and told him it was nothing, just river trash. She used it for kindling that night. When it caught fire, the smoke smelled faintly of salt and something older, like winter air trapped too long in wood. The churches that had tolled for the frozen dead rang bright again that season. Marriages were celebrated, children christened, the choir's voices rising strong against the vaulted ceilings. Yet, when the water lapped against the stone embankments during high tide, a low hum could sometimes be heard beneath the hymns, steady, patient, eternal. Those who heard it said it was the river whispering the names that had never been written, the ones that slipped through ink and memory both. Each year, when the frost returned and the first thin film of ice kissed the water's edge, Londoners would stop on the bridges and stare down at the current. Some smiled, others shivered without knowing why, and when the fog rolled in thick and white, they could almost imagine the old fair returning tents flickering through the mist, lanterns glowing faintly over a river that no longer moved. But the Thames would not be tricked a second time. It flowed on, dark and knowing, carrying its secrets toward the sea. It had watched men dance on its back, burn their fires upon its skin, and sink beneath its heart. It had felt their joy, their hunger, their arrogance, and their fear. It had taken what was owed and left the rest to remembrance. London forgot because it could, the river remembered because it must. And so, when night fell, and the bells of street pools faded into fog, the water whispered softly beneath the arches, a sound like breathing, like mourning, like ice cracking in the dark. Those who lingered long enough to listen swore they could hear words carried by the current, low and certain, older than the city itself. I remember, and then the tide turned, and the sound was gone, leaving only the river, eternal and watchful, flowing beneath a city that would never again dare to walk upon its back.